I'm the Dolphin of France. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 301, The Emperor Who Was Ridiculed. No, none of it. Joseph suddenly realized that he was careless. According to the custom of later generations, he did not need to think about marriage at the age of 15. However, in the 18th century, this was infinitely close to the ranks of older unmarried young men. Queen Mary's frown deepened. My dear, you are already 15 years old. Your grandfather and great-grandfather were already married when you were your age. She glanced at Louis XVI again. Although your father married me when he was 16, it's a little late. Don't be like him. Louis XVI nodded in agreement. Queen Mary held her son's hand, took a deep breath, and said in as gentle a tone as possible, my dear, since you have no dissatisfaction with Clementine, why don't you marry her as soon as possible? When you give birth to children, the people of France will feel more at ease. Joseph felt extremely passive at the moment. I have considered the entire continent, including Africa and America, but I have never thought of planning my own marriage. Who would be in a hurry to find a wife for a 15-year-old boy? It's only been 2 years of development. Okay, it is common sense that marrying too young is not good for your health. My great-grandfather and grandfather married young, but one only lived to be 64 years old, and the other died at the age of 36. Have you never thought about the reason for this? Moreover, Clementine was really related to him. Did he want him to practice orthopedics in France in the 18th century? Even she was only 12 years old. If such a punishment was left to future generations, it would start in 3 years and there would be no cap. Seeing her son's silence, Queen Mary said earnestly, my dear, if you want to be with that girl named Perna, it's not impossible, but what should I say? Her background is too low. If you like her, you can let her, she stays with you. But as a formal marriage partner, I think she must be a princess of a country, or at least the daughter of a crown prince. Joseph almost spat out a mouthful of old blood. Why did his mother involve Dr. Perna again? He tried to calm down, thought for a while, and decided to follow the ambition routine. Mother, when it comes to love, there is only one true love for me, France. As the crown prince, I hope that under the witness of God France will be at the top of Europe. If I must get married, I must find a princess from a country that can give France great support. Obviously, that country is not Austria. Queen Mary suddenly looked surprised. Do you think there is a more suitable country than Austria? Joseph nodded. You should have heard that Austria has just been defeated by the Prussian and Nepalese forces in the southern Netherlands. If the southern Netherlands is lost, Austria's national strength will decline rapidly. It may even be surpassed by Prussia. No, brother, he can definitely take back the southern Netherlands. Queen Mary's voice immediately became louder. I know him. The Prussians can't scare him. A smile flashed in Joseph's eyes. Father, mother, then maybe we should wait until the war in the southern Netherlands is over before considering the issue of marriage with Austria. Louis XVI nodded with emotion, took his wife's hand, and whispered, my dear, Joseph has really grown up. He can already think about marriage from the perspective of the country. Maybe we are too anxious. When his wife was not paying attention, he winked at Joseph and gestured, you go first, I will persuade her. While his mother was still dazed, Joseph stood up, bowed, and quickly escaped from the little Trianon point. After a long time, Queen Mary looked at her husband resentfully. You know, those are all excuses. Louis XVI smiled and said, our son is so smart, he must have his own reasons. We should believe him. You really dote on him too much. Queen Mary sighed. Clementine is so beautiful and lovely. Why doesn't Joseph like her? Louis XVI kissed the back of his wife's hand and complimented her with rare emotional intelligence. With such a beautiful mother, he may have raised the definition of a beautiful woman very high. Disgusting. Queen Mary smiled coquettishly, but soon changed to a serious expression. But he is really not young. We must find a marriage partner for him before next year. Okay. Louis XVI also seemed to agree. I will have a good talk with him. Central and Eastern France Point Department of Troyes, an army with straight military uniforms, golden fleur-de-lis marks on their collars, and brand new August-style percussion guns on their backs, was lining up in a neat marching column and walking quickly toward the outskirts of the town point. There they will conduct an assessment standard demonstration to the famous Champagne Legion. They have done this work many times before, and the troops who have seen their demonstrations all got the result of confident destruction point after they left. Those capable and responsible officers or soldiers in the regiment submitted transfer applications to the general staff, requesting to join the Royal Guards Corps, even if they were willing to work as handymen. Their point in the middle of the team, a few soldiers caught a glimpse of the young officers riding horses in front of them, and started chatting in low voices. "Hey, is that Captain New? Do you know him?" It is said that they followed the path of General Berthier and mobilized the Guards Corps. A tall soldier with an unshaven beard said, "It seems to be called Napoleon, a weird name." "It's Napoleon. Napoleon Bonaparte." The middle-aged soldier behind them whispered, "He is an Italian, but he did not join the guards through connections. I heard that he was in the town of Amni. He made a great contribution to quelling the chaos. Haha." Two soldiers laughed. "You may not know that this officer who has made great achievements has never been able to pass the 5-kilometer run. He stayed in the military camp during the first few demonstrations." Well, it's not surprising that Italians are weaker. I also heard that the captain used to often take sick leave. It turns out he is still a sick man, so no wonder. Haha. The young officer riding the horse in front could vaguely hear the laughter of the soldiers behind him talking about him, and he couldn't help but have veins on his forehead. His hands holding the horse's reins had turned pale because of too much force. However, he couldn't refute it because that damn 5-kilometer run was simply too difficult. At first, he didn't believe that these soldiers could run such a long distance in 22 minutes, but the facts taught him a hard lesson. Only 3 of the entire legion failed to finish on time. One of the other 2 people had a fever, and the other had a broken boot. The worst thing is that the Guards Corps requires officers below the rank of major to complete 5-kilometer running training with the soldiers. He secretly swore in his heart that during this assessment standard demonstration, he would shut up the soldiers who laughed at him. When had Napoleon ever lost to someone else? Those guys who looked down on him in the military academy were eventually surpassed by his excellent results. Chapter 302 tell you what it means to be an elite. But Napoleon immediately remembered several other terrifying daily training items of the Guards Corps. Well, it's just daily training. It is said that there is also hell-like intensive training, which he has not experienced, yet. In all the daily training items, except shooting and drawing, he failed to meet the passing standards, especially tactical coordination. The Guards Corps has many tactical standards, which are completely different from what he learned in the military academy. It took him a week just to memorize these tactics, and he didn't know how long it would take to reach the level of muscle memory. Napoleon couldn't help but recall the shock he had received during the more than 2 months since he came to the Guards Corps, from new flash cat guns to artillery cluster tactics, from the theory of great depth to officers who hang out with soldiers all day long. From good food to free clothing repairs. These made him once suspect that he had attended a fake military school. So many practical and novel military theories and techniques were never taught at the Paris Military Academy. No instructor even mentioned it. He took a long breath, but fortunately, he unexpectedly came to the Guards Corps and was able to learn these military knowledge. When I devote myself to the great cause of Corsica's restoration in the future, this knowledge will definitely play a huge role. In fact, he originally planned to take leave and return to Corsica at the beginning of this month. According to the agreement of the restoration organization, on the 5th of an even-numbered month, the members will hold a secret gathering in Ajaccio Point. But he was very curious about this military combat effectiveness assessment, so he decided to skip the gathering. After all, accumulating more military skills was the most important thing. In order to regain the country, Corsica must first have an army that can withstand the French attack. Speaker Pauly once predicted very seriously that Napoleon would become the greatest general in the Corsican National Army. From then on, this became Napoleon's life goal. That afternoon, the 1st Guards Corps arrived at Troyes and camped on the outskirts less than 2 kilometers away from the Champagne Corps. Napoleon had a simple dinner then sent away the orderlies, went to an open space on the edge of the camp alone, and began to perform push-ups in accordance with the requirements of the physical training manual issued by the Guards Corps. After practicing for more than 40 minutes, the sky had completely darkened, and the late roll call whistle was blown in the camp point. He wiped the sweat from his face, and ran back to his company's camping location. With pain all over his body point, although he was very tired, he could clearly feel that after these 2 months of training, his strength and endurance had been greatly improved. The training manual will certainly be effective, because it was copied directly by Joseph according to the scientific fitness methods of later generations. Coupled with a protein-rich diet, the soldiers of the Guards Corps can improve their physical fitness as quickly as possible. If the height factor is ignored, basically all of the Guard soldiers can serve as elite grenadiers elsewhere. Note 1. Based on their strong physiques early the next morning, the officers of the General Staff responsible for combat effectiveness assessment arrived at the Champagne Corps station on time. Along with them were 1,200 soldiers of the 1st Guards Corps led by Lefebvre. Slightly different from the previous assessments, His Royal Highness the Crown Prince actually came to the scene this time, to take over from the officers of the General Staff, and be responsible for presiding over the assessment point on the east side of the Champagne Legion's school grounds. Joseph walked up to the review platform and said some opening remarks such as be loyal to the king, and maintain the heroic and fearless spirit of chivalry, and then announced the start of the assessment point. More than 7,000 soldiers of the Champagne Corps and lower level regiments began to file out of the school grounds in an orderly manner. Under the command of General Staff officers, they ran towards the hill 2 kilometers away. They will circle there, and then return to the school grounds. The entire 5-kilometer course is considered to be qualified if completed within 22 minutes, and excellent if completed within 20 minutes according to the assessment requirements previously announced by the General Staff Headquarters. Soldiers with excellent results can receive a bonus equivalent to 1 month's salary. Junior officers who have achieved outstanding results can be directly promoted to 1 level. Of course, the assessment content for officers is several more and more difficult than that for soldiers. An hour and 20 minutes later, most of the officers and soldiers of the Champagne Corps who participated in the assessment returned to the school grounds after a while. Joseph, who was already a little bored with waiting, took the assessment results submitted by the assessment officer and smiled at the corner of his mouth. As expected, the entire Legion's 5-kilometer run failed. The fastest return was a Grenadier Company commander, which took 25 minutes. Ordinary soldiers generally complete the entire race in about 40 minutes. Another 27 people lost their way and have not returned yet. The cavalry of the 1st Guards Corps has set out to find them. But speaking of it, the Champagne Corps is indeed the elite of the old army. For example, the number of people who got lost was enough to dwarf other legions. In previous assessments, a legion of 3,000 to 4,000 people could get hundreds of people lost. After Joseph asked the officers of the General Staff to announce the results of the assessment, the Champagne Corps, who were as tired as dead dogs on the school grounds, predictably complained, "Such a long distance, 22 minutes of absolute, it's impossible to finish." It took Captain Lacus 25 minutes to finish the run. He is stronger than a lion. 22 minutes? That's a joke. This is simply the officers in Paris trying to make things difficult for us. I bet there is no army in the world that can meet the assessment standards. Hush. Keep your voice down. His Royal Highness the Crown Prince is on the reviewing stand. He can hear it best, and maybe he can order the General Staff to revise the assessment standards. Upon seeing this, Joseph smiled at each other and Lefebvre beside him and raised his hand to signal everyone to be quiet. The officers of the Champagne Corps were busy waving their riding whips and shouting at the soldiers who were still talking. When the school grounds became quiet, Joseph loudly ordered Lefebvre, "Major Lefebvre, assemble your troops immediately and prepare for a 5-kilometer cross-country running assessment demonstration." "Yes, Your Highness." Then Joseph turned to Baron d'Urquin, the commander of the Champagne Corps. "Please take the soldiers to the mound on the west side so that they can see the demonstration of the Guards Corps clearly. As you command, Your Highness." Baron d'Urquin, who was quite embarrassed by his subordinates' poor assessment results, hurriedly responded, Note 1. Grenadiers were originally a unit responsible for throwing grenades. Since grenades are very heavy, they need tall and strong soldiers. This results in grenadiers usually being tall and large. After the 18th century, the role of grenades on the battlefield has been very small. Grenadiers are usually used as infantry, but they are still the tallest and strongest soldiers in the army, and are usually used as elite assault troops. Chapter 303 The large-scale Versailles scene of the Guards Corps. On the high ground not far from the Champagne Corps, thousands of soldiers looked down. The staff even prepared a dozen pairs of telescopes for them to use in turn point soon. They saw a thin white line of soldiers running out of the school field at a speed that was unbelievable to them. If they were allowed to run at this speed, they would have to fall down from exhaustion after a kilometer at most point. However, the soldiers of the Guards Corps maintained this high speed almost throughout the entire process. A soldier of the Champagne Legion who got the binoculars suddenly exclaimed, "They are still carrying things." Others immediately grabbed the binoculars and said in surprise, "Yes, they all brought guns and blankets." An officer of the general staff heard the discussion of the soldiers, smiled and said loudly, "Each of them is carrying 18 pounds. Well, now we have to use the standard measurement, that is 9 kilograms of weight." The people in the Champagne Legion were stunned. They had just finished running 5 kilometers without bringing anything. To be precise, most of them had finished walking, and they were all so tired that they felt like they were about to die. The soldiers of the Guards Corps were still carrying such heavy loads. How could they finish the race in 22 minutes? After about 10 minutes, the soldiers of the Champagne Corps who watched the demonstration fell silent. They could clearly see from a high place that those people were not slowing down in speed, and they had already finished halfway and started to turn back. Finally someone whispered, "Are they all monsters?" After a moment of silence, a lieutenant officer sighed and said, "Maybe we are just too bad." Napoleon turned around the circular mountain road and felt that his legs were about to lose feeling. The luggage on his back was like a mountain, making it difficult for him to even breathe. He raised his head and glanced at the soldiers around him who were still speeding up. He immediately gritted his teeth and whispered to himself, "I won't lose to you. Isn't it just running?" His feet suddenly accelerated a bit, surpassing the soldiers in front, and thought to himself, "Look, this is not difficult. Come on, one more." After running for an unknown amount of time, Napoleon finally saw the gate of the school grounds in the distance. Although his chest and abdomen were throbbing with pain, a smile appeared on his lips. He felt that, based on the speed this time, he should be able to pass sure enough. The moment he crossed the gate, the officer next to him looked at his watch and said, 21 minutes and 19 seconds. Napoleon pressed his abdomen and resisted the vomiting sensation after strenuous exercise, but he felt strong joy in his heart. He finally passed another test point. This deadly Guards Corps is one step closer to conquering it. As the last few guardsmen ran into the school field, the entire 5-kilometer cross-country demonstration came to an end. The slowest soldier took 21 minutes and 52 seconds. All qualified point on the distant mounds. Thousands of the Champagne Legion were silent. They have always considered themselves to be one of the most elite legions in France, and have always looked down upon other troops. But today, they know what the real elite is. The slowest soldier among others was 3 minutes faster than Captain Lacoste, the fastest on his side. And he was still carrying 18 pounds of weight. This dealt a devastating blow to their arrogant self-confidence. Anyone who has actually experienced the battlefield knows that physical strength plays a huge role in battles. Wars in this era often lasted for a long time, because the firepower was not intense enough, and it was very common to fight from sunrise to sunset. If the enemy's physical strength is greatly reduced, but you still have sufficient physical strength, you can launch a fierce attack, but the opponent only has the strength to defend passively. In addition, with sufficient physical strength, you can also perform large maneuvers, bypass or outflank, which are the key to determining victory or defeat. However, there were still some officers from the Champagne Corps who commented unconvincingly, "It's just running. If we strengthen our training, we should be able to do it." That's right. Give me 5 months. No, 3 months, and I can finish the run in 22 minutes. However, the shooting assessment on the second day gave them another devastating blow. Point according to the assessment requirements, only a few dozen chasseurs in the Champagne Corps, a type similar to later snipers, met the passing standards. As for the Guards Corps, there are only more than 20 soldiers who are not qualified. To be honest, the muskets of this era sometimes have to be judged by their appearance, because there is no rifling. Brownian motion is likely to occur after the bullet flies out. No matter how accurate the aim is, there is no guarantee that it will hit the target point. The more than 20 unlucky guys were teased a lot by their teammates, and each one of them was so angry that they went off to carry out gun training alone. Unfortunately, Napoleon was one of these 20 people. However, he did not practice holding a gun because he was an artilleryman and his shooting performance was not included in the assessment. And he also believes that cap gun shooting is not a skill that must be mastered. He was studying logistics and supply science in the tent. This was part of the officer's assessment, and he was still very new to it. Joseph never thought that, if Napoleon had not been determined, his approach of recruiting Napoleon into the Guards would have almost destroyed Napoleon's self-confidence. In the following days, the Guards Corps continued to torture the Champagne Corps with assessment results. The latter were almost numb to this. From running to shooting, from lining up to fighting, they were crushed by others. If they didn't numb themselves, they would simply not be able to survive. When all the assessment items were over, and the officers and soldiers of the Champagne Corps were ready to breathe a sigh of relief, the Guards Corps used the last day of joint training to give them the heaviest mental blow. What kind of joint training is this? It's just a large-scale Versailles scene. From the first sight of the Champagne Corps clothes to the Guards Corps, tears of envy flowed from their mouths. The woolen uniforms with excellent texture and each shape are several levels higher than the cheap ones on their bodies. The unique percussion cap gun is said to have 3 fewer steps to load than the Charleville 1776 in their hands. And the range is more than 20 steps longer. As for the benefits of leather boots, leather hats, free sewing, etc., they don't want to compete with others. When it was lunchtime, the people of the Champagne Corps finally broke through the defense. The soldiers of the Guards Corps ate beef with sauce. Although it was also pickled meat, it tasted more than 10 times better after cooking. There were also boiled eggs, white bread and vegetable soup. They drank high quality wine. This is even better than the food of their officers. The soldiers of the Champagne Legion looked at the hard bacon, black bread, and sour wine in their hands, and almost couldn't help but grab the food of the guards. However, thinking of the other side's horrible shooting and fighting results, they still ate their pig food silently. Note 1. Sour wine is wine that has failed to ferment and has a sour taste. However, because these wines are cheap, they still have a large market among civilians. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 304. Get the Emperor's family letter. More than the food itself, what made the soldiers of the Champagne Corps envious was that the officers of the Guards Corps actually ate with the soldiers. Even the food in the bowl looks exactly like the soldiers. They all muttered in their hearts, "This is an officer worthy of serving and worthy of respect." In comparison, those officers of the Champagne Legion just regard themselves as animals that can shoot. Then, they were shocked to see that His Royal Highness the Crown Prince was also gathering with a group of soldiers from the Guards Corps, eating food from the pot. "Well, this soup tastes good." Joseph dipped the bread into the red soup and put it in his mouth. "Tomato soup with a hint of spiciness. Tastes a lot like Borst." Lefebvre nodded and said, "Yes, Your Highness. This is the soldier's favorite food besides meat." The staff officer on the side continued, "It's all about ketchup. Oh my god, who invented this thing? Fresh tomatoes taste amazing." The genius inventor Joseph did not take advantage of this and turned to glance at Napoleon, who was busy eating. "Captain Buonaba, are you still used to the life of the guards?" The latter was startled, quickly put down the food, and stood at attention with a snap. "I'm used to it, Your Highness. Everything is fine." "Well, you don't have to be so nervous. Joseph thought to himself that the two of us would still have to cooperate in the future, and we couldn't be so tense all the time. He suddenly noticed Napoleon's eyes and said doubtfully, "Why are your eyes so bloodshot? You haven't rested." Okay, Napoleon really didn't get a good rest. He spent more than 2 months in the Guards Corps working hard to make up lessons. He had a personality that refused to admit defeat and only slept 5 or 6 hours a day. "No, it's nothing, Your Highness. Thank you for your concern." The army staff officer turned to Joseph and said, "Your Highness, Captain Buwanaba has worked very hard. He has completed several basic assessments since he came to the Legion." Joseph nodded approvingly to Napoleon and then started chatting mode. "By the way, after leaving Troyes, you will rush to Verdun." The Legion staff officer was surprised and said, "Your Highness, it seems there are no legions that need to be assessed." "It's not an assessment," Joseph said. "We are going to fight. Fighting against a truly powerful enemy." The eyes of the surrounding officers and soldiers immediately flashed with excitement. According to the system of the Guards Corps, fighting means military merit and honor, which also means promotion. There is also the envy and reverence of family members and neighbors. This is due to the effective work of the Ministry of Military Affairs. The homes of officers and soldiers who have made meritorious deeds will experience a bombing with military bands, banners, flowers, and bonuses. Coupled with the fact that they have publicized their meritorious deeds in the neighborhood for 3 consecutive days, the officers and soldiers who made meritorious deeds will immediately become heroes in the neighborhood. When they return home, the feeling of pride and honor is simply better than being promoted. "Your Highness, who are we going to fight?" a company commander asked immediately. "It's not certain yet, but there should be Prussians among them." When everyone heard that they could fight against serious European armies, they were all eager to try. They had defeated the Algiers and Albanian armies before, and defeated the Montcalm army, but those were not enough to prove their strength. If the Prussians could be defeated on the battlefield, who would dare to question the validity of the Guards Corps record? Speaking of fighting, Joseph suddenly remembered something, and turned to ask Lefebvre, "Mr. Major, has the latest compact gun carriage arrived?" The latter shook his head. "It wasn't there when we left Paris, Your Highness. But at that time, the ordnance factory had already sent the training manual, saying it would arrive within a week." Joseph breathed a sigh of relief, but it was still a little late. He warned, "Then just transport the mounted artillery carriage directly to Verdun. You should hurry up and practice operations there. There may not be much time before the war starts." When Napoleon heard the word mounted on a gun carriage, he suddenly became interested and asked the legionary staff officer on the side, "Sir, what new equipment was Your Highness just talking about?" "Oh, it's a fast-moving gun carriage. You'll know it when you get to Versailles." The army staff looked down upon this Corsican. Discrimination against foreigners was very common in this era, let alone a small border island. The bumpkin who came up. Napoleon wanted to ask more questions, but when he saw the army staff and His Royal Highness the Crown Prince talking about training, he couldn't say anything for a while, and his heart was as anxious as if it were being scratched by dozens of cats. If you want to see the gun carriage, you will definitely miss the next gathering of the Corsican Restoration Organization. Maybe Speaker Paulie will have some new instructions, but the new equipment related to cannons is equally attractive. Just when he was in a dilemma and didn't know how to make a choice, early the next morning, the Legion's postman came to Troyes. This is the most exciting moment for all the soldiers. The few wooden boxes brought by the postman contain news about their family members, lovers, or friends. They are the only way between them and the military camp. After the crowd receiving the letters dispersed, Napoleon walked up to the 2 postmen and gave his name, Napoleon Buwanaba. "Do you have my letter?" A tall postman picked up the record book and searched according to the alphabetical index of the name, then took out a letter from the second wooden box and handed it to him. "There's your letter. It's from Joseph Buwanaba. Oh, a very unique last name. Is he your father or your brother?" "It's my eldest brother," Napoleon answered casually, took the letter and quickly returned to his tent, and then he couldn't wait to open it and read it. In the letter, the eldest brother first asked about Napoleon's recent situation in the army as usual. Then, He told him in an excited tone that by chance last month, he was selected by the Assistant Secretary of Commerce to become a affairs assistant in the negotiation representative office. Because there is an urgent need for people, there is no need to pay for this position yourself. The monthly salary is 65 livres, and there are generous allowances. Napoleon smiled happily. This was much better than the half-dead business his brother had run before. With this stable salary income, I finally no longer have to deal with the huge debt at home alone. Joseph Buonabe's government position was naturally arranged for him by Joseph's instructions. The Corsican people have a strong sense of family. After Napoleon's father passed away, his eldest brother became like a father. Napoleon also listened very much to his brother. Therefore, Joseph arranged Napoleon's eldest brother into the French bureaucracy first. As the latter continued to advance, sooner or later, the butt determines the head. At that time, even if Napoleon wanted to restore Corsica, his eldest brother would not agree. Napoleon continued to look down, and Joseph Buonabe told him that when he sent this letter, he had already left Paris with the Secretary of Commerce and went to Bavaria to participate in an important trade negotiation. Chapter 305 Talent Selection. Napoleon couldn't help but sigh. He always felt that his brother shouldn't give up the law major he studied to do business. Facts have proved that his brother's business ability is really not good, and he has barely broken even for so many years. Now that his brother has been working in the negotiation office for a short time, he can go abroad with the Minister of Commerce for negotiations. It seems that he has found a way to give full play to his strengths. The second half of Joseph Buonabe's letter is a message from their mother Maria Letizia. The mother said that the government finally issued the compensation for the vineyard last month, which reduced the family's debt by half and greatly reduced the interest pressure. In addition, the French Brewing Technology Association has decided to invest in a large winery in Ajaccio, and construction is currently underway. In order to ensure sufficient raw materials, the winery has signed supply contracts with vineyards around Ajaccio. In the future, as long as there is no natural disaster, the Buonabe family can get a stable income of nearly 2,000 livres every year. In a word, the family's financial situation has improved a lot, and they can even take out some money to hire people to work in the vineyard. In the end, his mother told Napoleon that he would not need to ask for leave to go home to help in the future, and he should perform well in the army and strive for promotion as soon as possible. In fact, Napoleon's so-called going home to help was just to take the opportunity to participate in the activities of the Corsica Restoration Organization. But when he saw what was said in the letter, he felt relieved for some reason and shook his head and said to himself, "It seems that it will not be easy to return to Corsica before finding a new excuse to ask for leave that can hide it from my mother." In other words, he can go to Verdun to visit the new type of horse artillery vehicle without any worries. What he didn't know was that the affairs of his family's vineyard were all arranged by His Royal Highness the Crown Prince, so that he could stay in the army with peace of mind. Of course, Joseph built a winery in Corsica to improve the living standards of the people there. Everyone saw the channel to make money, so they must be busy growing grapes. Who would want to overthrow French rule? Even the winery was built by the French. If the French were driven away, who would sell the grapes to? While Napoleon was reading the letter, in the cavalry camp not far away, a soldier of about the same age as him, with curly hair, a slightly fat face, and a slightly melancholy look, was lying on the hay cart, writing a letter quickly, so that he could hand it to them before the postman left. He bit his pencil, lowered his head, and continued to write. "Dear Father, I have made the final decision not to go back to Fortigny Castle to learn how to sell fashion, because I have found my true life goal today, which is to join the Guards Corps and become an outstanding cavalry officer. Yes, in the Guards Corps, no matter what your background is, you can be promoted to an officer, as long as you are brave enough and train hard enough. Do you know what a magical army it is? Their soldiers were all very strong. With guns and blankets on their backs, they could run 5 kilometers in 20 minutes, or 1.25 leagues. They changed formations so quickly that it was as if a giant was pulling them with a string, and their shooting skills were amazing, and their handsome uniforms. In short, I'm very sure that this is where my dream will come true. Please forgive me, I really can't go back. Otherwise Fort Fortinia will lose a great general. After he finished writing, he read it again, and wrote at the end of the letter, Joachim Murat, and put the letter into an envelope. Then he took out the Guards Corps application form, that he kept close to his body, and began to fill it out attentively. The cavalry company commander passed by him, glanced at the half-filled application form, but walked away with his head raised as if he had seen nothing. He also filled out the same application form and had just handed it to the postman. In fact, almost everyone in the Champagne Corps was filling out this thing at this time. Bavaria. Northwest of Munich. A black carriage bumped past on the bumpy road. In the carriage, Joseph Buonaba carefully checked the documents in his hand and checked the numbers with his assistant from time to time, appearing to be extremely focused. The pile of documents was the result of his recent business research in Württemberg, including a large number of questionnaires and data collected on the spot. And these things are important materials that will be used in the trade negotiations the day after tomorrow. After arriving in Munich, he first reported his work to the assistant to the Minister of Commerce, his immediate superior, and then stayed in the hotel to memorize the data until the beginning of June, when the negotiations officially began. Outside the Munich Palace, the band and the Guard of Honor filled both sides of the road. The etiquette officers shuffled back and forth to the sound of music to welcome the negotiators from various countries. Bavarian Grand Duke Karol Otto presided over a brief negotiation opening ceremony in the square in front of the palace, and then threw everything to State Minister Pimentel and left in a depressed mood. It was no wonder that he was in a bad mood. Not long ago, he was still planning how to give the territory of the southern Netherlands to his illegitimate children. As a result, he received the news of Austria's defeat, which ruined all his dreams. Pimentel invited all the negotiators to enter the conference hall, gave a speech, and then looked at the Austrian Foreign Minister Baron Thugut. The latter smiled and nodded, stood up and walked to the front of the conference hall, cleared his throat, and said loudly, "I believe you all know very well how chaotic the current trade situation in the German region is. The changing tariffs, the sudden emergence of various fees, and various access system restrictions have greatly hindered our trade development. So, under the joint initiative of His Majesty the Holy Roman Emperor," he said, signaling to Talleyrand and Bailly, "and His Majesty the King of France, we will discuss and sign an unprecedented great agreement." However, unlike his passion, representatives from Bavaria, Salzburg, Württemberg, Baden and other countries seem to be not very interested. These small countries can hardly compete with big countries like France and Austria in the fields of industry and trade, so they are all worried about the so-called free trade. But because they don't want to offend Joseph II, they can only go through the motions. And they don't really expect to reach any trade agreement. After saying the polite words, Baron Turgot asked his assistant to send the trade planning documents that had been prepared to everyone. "This is the preliminary agreement plan drafted by Austria. Please take a look. Of course, this is just a draft, and we still need to discuss the specific terms in detail before we can determine them." Chapter 306 Negotiation Techniques. The trade agreement covers all aspects, and even if it is just a simple draft, the documents are still a thick stack. It took the negotiators from all countries the whole morning to go over the general content. This was after Austria had notified them of the general framework of the agreement before. Otherwise they would have spent the whole day on it. However, when everyone took a closer look at the terms, they all looked surprised and then began to whisper among themselves. "It says that we can maintain a 60% tariff on wine imported from France, and we can also maintain a 60% tariff on Austrian iron products. Maintaining the 38% tariff seems to be okay. We can even impose an 80% tariff on French paper, which is different from what I originally thought, except that France's textile tariffs need to be consistent with those of the UK. Other conditions are not too harsh. It can even be said, quite reasonable. Austria only imposes a 10% tariff on most goods exported from Württemberg. It's the same here. I can enter Austria and France with very low tariffs soon. It was lunchtime point on the way to the restaurant. Bavarian Minister of State Pimentel took the trade representatives of several small countries and discussed in a low voice, although on the surface, the terms of the agreement proposed by Austria are more beneficial to them. Our industrial competitiveness far inferior to France and Austria, especially France. For example, the draft requires us to impose a maximum tariff of 12% on French machinery products and 15% on chemical products. This seems to be very detrimental to us. Count 1 Zengerode, the plenipotentiary of Württemberg, nodded and looked at him and said, "Then what do you think we should do? This trade agreement is a good opportunity." Pimentel looked around at several people. "It gives our goods the opportunity to enter the two huge markets of France and Austria, but we must unite and fight for more favorable terms from them. Condition. Specifically, we must be consistent when discussing specific tariff amounts. Oh, of course, Bavaria will also make concessions to your countries, so please rest assured." Several other representatives nodded after hearing this. Indeed, as Pimentel said, according to the provisions of the draft, the tariffs imposed by France and Austria on them are almost negligible, and their goods have the possibility of entering France and Austria, which was difficult to achieve before. Therefore, the focus of subsequent negotiations will be on the upper limit of tariffs they can impose on France and Austria. After all, when small countries like them face highly competitive products from big countries, they can only rely on tariffs to protect their markets. At 2:30 p.m. trade negotiations continued. Count Winzengrad of Württemberg stood up first and said to the French Minister of Commerce, "Dear Mr. Bailey, for your country's iron products exported to Württemberg, I think the 12% tariff is too low. You know, there are many iron making workshops in Württemberg, and we need to provide them with some protection. Perhaps the tariff on iron products can be increased to about 35%. Upon hearing this, representatives from Bavaria and other countries immediately followed suit, saying, "Bavaria hopes to increase French steel tariffs to 30%. Salzburg also hopes to increase it to 30%. Bailly then stood up and said some clichés. It was nothing more than that France also attaches great importance to protecting your industry, but the tariff rate has not relaxed at all. Seeing that the situation was frozen, Count Winzengrad was about to threaten to withdraw from negotiations, but he saw Bay signaling to the young official behind him, "Mr. Bauernaba, please provide the iron products trade data between France and Württemberg." "Give it to Count Winzengrad." "Yes, my lord." Joseph Buarnaba immediately turned out a few pages of documents, politely placed them on the table in front of the Württemberg representative, and explained thoughtfully, "Your Majesty, look, in the past 5 years, France has exported to Württemberg. The average price of iron products is only 110,000 livres per year. At the same time, the average price of local iron products in Württemberg was only 14.8 sous. In other words, French iron products are almost uncompetitive in Württemberg. Before technological innovation, the iron-making technology of European countries was of the same level. France, which is not rich in iron resources, has no advantage over small countries." Count Winzengerode was suddenly startled. He had no idea about these detailed figures. He really didn't know where the French calculated them. In fact, when Joseph was preparing to expand the German market, he sent people to investigate the industry and trade conditions of various countries, spending hundreds of thousands of livres. Therefore, this draft trade agreement is by no means aimless. It can ensure that the tariff amount above is acceptable to all countries. Later generations would conduct extensive business research before entering into trade negotiations. In the 18th century, everyone still acted based on experience and did not have this awareness at all, so they were bound to be passive in negotiations. Joseph Buyanaba smiled and pointed to the next page. "You see, this is an intention survey of 200 Württemberg residents, and only 7 people expressed their willingness to buy French iron products. So, you don't have to worry about local iron workers at all. The shop is threatened." Count Winzengrad looked at the questionnaires in surprise. They had the signatures of the interviewees on them, so they could not be forged. He didn't know how to argue for a moment, so he had to sit down and grilly. Then the Bavarians questioned France's tariffs on chemical products. Bailey followed suit and asked the official in charge of Bavaria's business research to smear detailed data on Count Pimentel's face, using a lot of evidence to prove that a 15% tariff was enough to protect their chemical industry. In this way, the negotiations lasted until the third day. France used data to speak and questionnaires as evidence to basically ensure that there were no major changes in the tariffs of various countries on French goods. On the other hand, Austria agreed to increase the tariff quotas under the soft and hard persuasion of several small countries. It was not until the fifth day of the negotiations that Bailey smiled and brought out the free transportation on inland waterways clause. Vienna. Schönbrunn Palace. Joseph II frowned at his brother and asked weakly, "You mean Paris has not confirmed the marriage?" Leopold II nodded with a gloomy face. Antoinette's letter did not mention the engagement. "Your Majesty, you know that Clementine even lived in Paris for a year. What they did is simply a humiliation to the Habsburg family." Joseph II was silent for a long time and sighed. "It should be, because Clementine is too young and can't give birth, so my sister made such a decision. What he said is not without precedent. At the beginning, Louis XV was even engaged to a Spanish princess, but because the latter was too young to give birth to an heir, she was eventually sent back to Spain." Chapter 307 French aid. Leopold II was still angry. Austria should also express its attitude on this. Joseph II waved his hand tiredly to interrupt him. "General Wurmser just suffered a defeat in Rochefort. Now the German countries are watching our reaction, and we must give a strong counterattack to the Prussians." Leopold II's eyes dropped immediately. He knew very well that the Austrian aristocracy was extremely dissatisfied with his brother's reforms and was unwilling to contribute to the country. Bohemia, Croatia, Hungary and other countries also resisted the royal family because the reforms touched their interests. Note 1. In such a situation, Austria could not afford to fight a decisive battle with Prussia. But if the southern Netherlands was allowed to be independent, the German states would inevitably think that Austria was already weak and would throw themselves into the arms of Prussia. 69. This is an unacceptable situation. Joseph II paused for a few seconds and continued. "Now we can only defeat Prussia if we persuade France to provide support. Clementine is not engaged to the French crown prince, so let this matter go." Leopold II also knew the pros and cons and nodded reluctantly. Then he thought of something and looked at his brother and said, "Your Majesty, although we are married to France, according to the supplementary terms signed by Gravier and our country, France does not assume military obligations to our country." The Gravier he was talking about was Count Vergennes, Louis XV's foreign minister, and the one who facilitated Queen Mary of Austria to marry Louis XVI. However, as a very experienced politician, Count Vergennes took advantage of Austria's request to France and pushed France's marriage obligations completely. In fact, after the century-old enemies of France and Austria formed an alliance for short-term interests, they hardly supported each other. "I know." Joseph II nodded. "So we must do our best to convince Antoinette. After all, she is a sister. In addition, France seems to attach great importance to the trade agreement with the southern German countries. We can give them some help in this regard in exchange for their military assistance." According to Austria's original plan, France could not be allowed to break into the southern German market too easily. They would add a lot of restrictions to the trade terms between France and Germany and build very high tariff barriers for Bavaria, Württemberg and other countries to ensure that they were the masters of this market. However, the situation is stronger than people. At present, Austria can only offer benefits in this regard in exchange for France's military support. Fortunately, the French are very tolerant of the high tariffs of the German states and only require a few categories of goods such as iron products and machinery to reduce tariffs, which is acceptable to Austria. At the same time, Austria can also use this trade agreement to enter the French market. And no matter how this trade agreement is signed, As long as the French send troops, at least it can ensure that Austria's reforms can continue. This is what Joseph II attaches the most importance to. His reforms must not be interrupted, otherwise, with Austria's current situation, it will sooner or later lose its status as a first-class European power in the spacious corridor of Schönbrunn Palace. Talleyrand followed the court officials to quickly. He walked towards Leopold II's reception room. He had just returned from the negotiation venue in Munich at the latter's invitation. Talleyrand recalled Leopold II's letter and couldn't help but sigh. When he left Strasbourg last month, His Royal Highness the Crown Prince told him that Austria was very likely to be defeated in the southern Netherlands. As a result, Wurmser was defeated by the Duke of Brunswick. According to His Royal Highness the Crown Prince's instructions, the Austrian high-level officials, it could be the Emperor, or it could be the Minister of State, would consult with him later to let France send troops to assist Austria. Then there was this summons from Leopold II, who was equivalent to the Austrian Crown Prince. Talleyrand immediately straightened his chest, so the follow-up arrangements made by His Royal Highness the Crown Prince would be implemented by himself. In the reception room, after a simple greeting, Leopold II led the topic to the war in the southern Netherlands. As I said just now, General Wurmser withdrew the main force to the dense forest near Luxembourg, thus preserving most of the troops. That is to say, we are still keeping huge military pressure on the rebels. Talleyrand knew that the Austrian army did not suffer too many casualties, but the so-called maintaining pressure was just diplomatic rhetoric. Blücher's 20,000 troops and tens of thousands of Dutch rebels blocked the west of Luxembourg. If they were not worried about an ambush in the Black Forest, they would have driven the Austrian army into Bavaria long ago. Of course, French logistical supplies were also an important guarantee for Wurmser to continue to persist. Otherwise the Austrian army would have to snatch potatoes from Luxembourg farmers to fill their stomachs. He just smiled at Leopold II, but did not respond. The latter had to continue with some embarrassment. His Majesty the Emperor has decided to mobilize 80,000 troops to Luxembourg to let William II understand how stupid it was to interfere in the affairs of the southern Netherlands. Of course, the Prussians are likely to increase their troops. At the same time, the Dutch also provided a lot of assistance to the rebels, although His Majesty the Emperor's army is confident that it can defeat any enemy. The war is likely to drag on for a long time. You know, this is very uneconomical financially. He glanced at Talleyrand. If Austria's close French ally can provide some military support at this time, it will greatly accelerate the Prussians' defeat. After he finished speaking, he looked at the French foreign minister. His Majesty the Emperor also ordered that Austria will try its best to consider France's opinions in the negotiations of the Seine-Rhine Trade Agreement. The Seine-Rhine Trade Agreement is a new name agreed upon by negotiators from various countries a few days ago. The Seine represents France, and the Rhine just passes through the southern German countries. At the same time, this name can reflect France's idea of using inland shipping for trade. Leopold II continued, I hope you can convey the Emperor's opinion to His Majesty the King of France as soon as possible. I look forward to further close cooperation between the two countries. Talleyrand nodded, recalled the instructions of His Royal Highness the Crown Prince, and smiled. Your Majesty, in fact, after learning about the war situation in the southern Netherlands, His Majesty the King has authorized me to sign an agreement with you on military assistance at any time. Leopold II was overjoyed when he heard this, thinking that his sister was still concerned about her mother's family. Before he even opened his mouth, she had already prepared to reinforce Austria. Chapter 308 The France-Austria friendship is unbreakable. Leopold II immediately ordered his servants to get a map of the southern Netherlands. He was about to discuss the details of reinforcement with the French when he heard Talleyrand say, Your Majesty, in fact, the General Staff is planning this war. After careful analysis, we believe that we should not continue to send more troops to the southern Netherlands. No more troops? Leopold II's face suddenly darkened. Are you asking me to abandon the southern Netherlands? No, you misunderstood. Talleyrand's expression became serious. The General Staff's suggestion is that using the southern Netherlands as the main battlefield is extremely detrimental to Austria. Just Then the servant brought the map, and he pointed to the location of southern Netherlands. You see, it is very close to Prussia and the Netherlands, and there are rebels everywhere. Austria is 800 kilometers away from there, so whether it's troop reinforcement or logistics, it's at an absolute disadvantage. In addition, even if you invest heavily in the rebels and eventually eliminate the rebels, the southern Netherlands will be severely damaged by the war. In that case, even if the Prussians withdraw from the southern Netherlands, they will be equivalent to victory. Leopold II frowned and looked at him. Please tell me your suggestions. Talleyrand took a step forward, met his gaze, and said in a deep voice, since Prussia and Austria have actually started a war, you should no longer have any worries. The best strategy is to choose the battlefield that is beneficial to you, and where you can gain the greatest benefit, and the battlefield that is most beneficial to Austria is undoubtedly Silesia. It is semi-surrounded by Austria, and the people are more sympathetic to His Majesty the Emperor's rule. After all, it was Austrian territory 30 years ago. At the same time, the Netherlands and the southern Netherlands are unable to provide any support to the war situation in Silesia, and Prussia will face the powerful Austrian army alone. As long as the war in Silesia begins, Prussia will definitely withdraw its troops from the southern Netherlands and invest them in Silesia. And the southern Netherlands rebels who have lost the support of Prussia can be wiped out at any time. Talleyrand's radical suggestions moved Leopold II's mind. Recovering Silesia was undoubtedly a huge temptation, but he quickly calmed down and shook his head. Austria is currently undergoing reforms, and I'm afraid it is not suitable to carry out such a large-scale reform. War. Do you think the scale of the war can be controlled by fighting only in the southern Netherlands? Talleyrand asked. After His Majesty the Emperor increases his troops, the Prussians will immediately follow suit. In the end, both sides will still use all their national strength to determine the winner. But if there was a war in Silesia, even if the worst happened, and Austria failed to win, the war would destroy it, and leave the Prussians with a scorched earth. No matter how you calculate it, this is strategically beneficial. Leopold II always felt that something was wrong, but could not say it. After a while, he hesitated and said, if we attack Silesia, Saxony will definitely side with Prussia. In addition, Poland has also formed an alliance with Prussia. If they attack Austria from the east, the situation will quickly get out of control. Saxony has conflicts with Austria over Bavaria, and Silesia is next to Saxony, and each is the gateway to the other's territory. If Austria recaptures Silesia, it will definitely pose a serious threat to Saxony, so the latter will inevitably join the war. Talleyrand immediately said, yes, the Prussians have Saxony to help them, but don't forget that Austria also has France as a friend. As for Poland, I can assure you that France is confident in convincing them not to get involved in the war between Prussia and Austria. In fact, there is no need for French persuasion at all. Poland is currently undergoing a national awakening. All its thoughts are on implementing the constitution and resisting Russian aggression, and will not interfere in the affairs of other countries at all. Leopold II keenly grasped the meaning of his words. You mean, France will send troops to help us recover Silesia? Talleyrand smiled and nodded. His Majesty the King does have this plan. Leopold II nodded and then asked, so, what kind of reward does His Majesty the King need? He has been the Grand Duke of Tuscany for more than 20 years, so he naturally understands that there are no free gifts between countries. Talleyrand smiled more sincerely. You have just said that you will advance and retreat with France in trade negotiations. This is the best reward. Of course, if His Majesty the Emperor can recognize France's ownership of Piedmont, it will further demonstrate the deep friendship between the two countries. Piedmont is a large region in southeastern France that currently belongs to the Kingdom of Sardinia. Historically, France has always had its own claim on the ownership of this area. In addition, it is the entrance to Italy and has important strategic value. Sardinia has only two major neighbors, France and Austria, so Austria's attitude is very important point. In fact, Joseph has no idea of Piedmont, at least not yet. But asking Austria for nothing would make the latter doubt France's motives. In fact, as long as Poitou starts fighting, and the fight is bigger, Joseph will be very satisfied. Leopold II nodded. Okay, I will report this to His Majesty the Emperor. I firmly believe that the friendship between France and Austria is unbreakable. While he and Talleyrand were discussing joint dispatch of troops, Talleyrand's assistants were also active throughout Vienna. In a villa with a simple appearance, Austrian Field Marshal Franz von Lacy looked at the Frenchman in front of him seriously and said loudly, "Are you telling the truth, French?" Foreign Affairs Commissioner Conrad Hottinger nodded more seriously and said, "You may have heard that our Crown Prince said 2 years ago that there must be a war between France and Prussia. Yes, it is in Silesia that what His Royal Highness said will come true. How many troops will you deploy?" "I'm not sure about this. 50,000 or 70,000. You know, I'm not a professional soldier, Marshal." Lacy's eyes flashed with excitement. As a soldier who participated in the Silesian War, he dreamed of taking back that rich land all the time. And if France can send 70,000 troops, Austria will undoubtedly have a great chance of winning. Of course, as a diplomat, Hottinger's number of troops mentioned in informal occasions is not accurate at all, but it can be used to persuade. After some incitement, Marshal Lacy was already full of enthusiasm, and he personally escorted the French out of the villa, and then immediately rushed to Schönbrunn Palace. Similarly, in the home of Marshal Ernst Gideon von Lauden, French diplomatic commissioner Bellamy also spoke impassionately, recounting the history of Prussia's seizure of Silesia, which made the Marshal furious. "Those damn Prussians." The old Marshal banged on the table and roared, "We must let them know how powerful we are." Chapter 309 The Art of Talleyrand. In this way, Talleyrand's people either directly contacted the Austrian high-level officials, or spread rumors that the Austrian and French forces will join forces to retake Silesia. And no one will hold the French responsible for fanning the flames, because recovering Silesia and washing away the humiliation of decades is the political correctness of all Austrians at present. Anyone who dares to say that the French are wrong will be beaten by the Austrians next to him. Schönbrunn Palace. Bedroom of Joseph II. Due to His Majesty's physical condition getting worse and worse, imperial meetings have been held here for the past year. The core topic of this meeting was naturally the war with Prussia, so except for a dozen important ministers, almost all senior military officials were present. Due to caching reasons, please visit the Bookbar website directly with your browser to watch the fastest chapter updates. Crown Prince Leopold II briefly explained the situation to everyone, then turned and bowed to Joseph II and said, "Your Majesty, that's roughly it. The French idea is for the coalition forces to advance directly to Silesia and force the Prussians to leave from Nany. Delen withdraws his troops." Sitting on the bed, Joseph II braced himself and looked around at the officers and ministers in the room. "What do you think about this matter, Marshal?" Laodon was the first to speak out. "Your Majesty, this is a good opportunity to regain our homeland. I'm willing to lead the army personally to teach those Prussian bastards a lesson." Joseph II looked at the old marshal's body, which was not much better than his own. He hurriedly told him not to be excited and comforted him. "Your experience and courage are Austria's precious assets. Just let the young people handle the frontline matters, Marshal." Lacy and several other senior officers also immediately stood up. Not only had they been in contact with French diplomats, they had also been in contact with each other many times, and had already reached a consensus on sending troops to Silesia. "Your Majesty, with the strong support of France this time, it is a good opportunity for us to regain Silesia. Your Majesty, I also think that we have a good chance of winning this battle. Your Majesty, Prussia's attention is still on the southern Netherlands. We must send troops as soon as possible to catch the surprise." "I also agree to send troops as soon as possible." Count Kornitz, the Minister of State, was the leader of the pro-French faction in Austria. At this time, he stepped forward even more excitedly and said, "Your Majesty, as long as Austria and France unite closely this time, maybe not just Silesia, we can take advantage of this opportunity to defeat Saxony and then invade. It is not impossible to refer to Braunschweig. If this step can be achieved, His Majesty's prestige will shake the whole of Germany, and the glory of the Holy Roman Empire will be restored soon." When he said this, everyone present, no matter what they thought in their hearts, immediately shouted, "Restore the glory of the Holy Roman Empire." However, when the shouts subsided, the Minister of the Interior, Count Voltaire, suddenly frowned and said, I feel that the French want more than just their claim to Piedmont. After all, they will be involved in a very tragic war. The benefits are really too little. They should have other plans. If Joseph heard what he said, he would definitely praise him. You are right. But what's tragic is that Austria and France are so far away from each other, so how much you want to get involved depends entirely on your mood. At present, public opinion in Vienna against the attack on Silesia has formed. Who cares what the French think? Cornets immediately looked at the Minister of the Interior with a smile. Count Volatile, I'm afraid you don't know how much France attaches importance to trade agreements. I often go to Paris and know the situation there very well. The French government transferred a large amount of bank debt to the Industrial Development Fund, which may amount to hundreds of millions of florins. In other words, in the next few decades, France must ensure that product sales are in good condition in order to make the fund profitable, that is, to prevent French fiscal collapse. To do this, they must expand their market, and in the absence of colonies, they can only sell as much as possible to the Rhine River basin. This requires us to help them enter the market in South Germany. Immediately, two ministers agreed with Cornets' statement and made more in-depth additions. In fact, these two people were Talleyrand's own people in his development. More than half a month ago, he had transferred benefits to the two of them through his subordinates, spending hundreds of thousands of livres on them. Joseph knew that Archbishop Talleyrand was the best at giving and accepting bribes. Although this incident had overturned in history, it was entirely due to the unscrupulousness of the Americans, so he gave him this important task. Note 1. Of course, people from the intelligence bureau were also secretly watching Talleyrand at all times to ensure that the money would fall where it was needed. Facts have proved that Laiss's bribery skills, including the ability to screen bribery targets, are completely trustworthy. Two high-ranking Austrian officials who received money began to support France according to France's script. Count Voltaire, France is actually very consistent with our attitude in weakening Prussia. Prussia is the spokesperson of British interests on the European continent, and you should also do what the British did to France in North Africa. Heard about it. In addition, France and Prussia also have fierce competition in terms of influence on the Netherlands. Especially this time, the Dutch ignored France's attitude during the Brabant Rebellion and sided with the Prussians. This made the French very annoyed, as the two stated their stakes. The skeptics, including Count Voltaire, finally fell silent. Joseph II was very calm. He turned to look at Leopold II and whispered, "Do you think it's worth giving up the interests in Western Italy?" As the Grand Duke of Tuscany, the latter was most familiar with the situation in Italy. If France's claim to Piedmont is recognized, then Austria's Lombardy and Tuscany in Italy will face France directly, and even Venice will be difficult to protect. He said without hesitation, "Your Majesty, if we can get Silesia in exchange, this is acceptable. After all, if the French go too far in Italy, we can always introduce British forces to contain them." Joseph II was silent for a long time, and once again looked around at the ministers in front of him with firm eyes, and finally nodded solemnly. "Then, let's discuss the mobilization of troops and specific combat plans." Note 1. This incident, at the end of the 18th century, in order to make money, the Americans restored diplomatic relations with the British and expressed opposition to the French Revolution. So France decided to retaliate against the Americans, seizing and plundering a large number of American merchant ships, causing heavy losses to the United States. The then US President Adams sent a delegation to France for negotiations in an attempt to calm France's anger. Talleyrand, then French foreign minister, took the opportunity to instruct 3 of his men to demand huge bribes from the Americans. The Americans went to war with France in anger. The names of the 3 people who demanded bribes were called X, Y, and Z in diplomatic documents, and this incident got its name from this. Chapter 310 Historic Trade Agreement. As for the battle plan, Marshal Lacy and other senior military officials had already discussed it, and now they just brought it out. Austria recruited 80,000 troops from all over the country. Due to the influence of Joseph II's reform, this was already the limit of its military strength, led by Marshal Lacy, and secretly went to Silesia. At the same time, only 5,000 troops were left in Luxembourg, to keep an eye on the Brabant rebels, and the main force was brought back to Austria by General Wurmser, and after a brief rest, it was also deployed to Silesia, due to cash reasons. Please visit the Bookbar website directly in the browser to watch the fastest chapter update. On the Bavarian side, try to persuade Karol Otto to send 10,000 to 20,000 troops, and the bargaining chip is naturally the exchange of the territory of the southern Netherlands. France needs to send more than 50,000 troops if the military support that the southern German states may provide is added. The Austrian coalition can probably gather 150,000 to 170,000 troops in the direction of Silesia. At present, Prussia can recruit no more than 120,000 troops, and Saxony is almost certain to participate in the war with a force of about 30,000. In other words, in terms of total military strength, the Austrian coalition has a certain advantage. Moreover, whether it is the Austrian army or the French army, the combat effectiveness will not be weaker than that of Prussia, but far stronger than that of Saxony. As long as France ensures that Poland does not send troops to support Prussia as agreed, the Austrian coalition will have a great chance of winning. If France can send more troops, it can even crush Prussia. It was not until dusk that the imperial meeting in Schönbrunn Palace came to a temporary end. Of course, the person presiding over the meeting had already been replaced by Leopold II. After confirming that the troops would be sent to Silesia, His Majesty the Emperor changed rooms to rest. After the meeting, Leopold II seemed to be worried. He knew that there was another extremely important factor to consider in the Battle of Silesia, that is, Russia's attitude. Russia and Prussia have highly consistent interests in Poland. If Prussia's war situation is unfavorable, Catherine II is very likely to send troops to intervene. Although Russia is still at war with Sweden, with its powerful military force, it can have a huge impact on the war situation by randomly dividing a few legions. So how to ensure that Russia stays out? Leopold II rubbed his eyebrows and suddenly remembered that France and Russia have recently dealt with the Ottomans and their huge common interests in Mediterranean trade. He thought to himself, it seems that my dear sister needs to come forward on my behalf. But what should I use in return? Bavaria. Munich. Palace. Negotiation site of the Seine-Rhine trade agreement regarding the tariff on wood products. I still hope to increase it a little bit. Count Winzengerode of Württemberg looked at Bailey. It should be at least 45%. Austrian Foreign Minister Baron Thugut shook his head and interrupted him. You always get entangled in these trivial issues. If it continues like this, I'm afraid that a trade agreement will not be reached by the end of the year, and this will cause all of our countries to lose nearly half a year's worth of trade revenue. I think you just need to grasp the overall direction. You shouldn't let your family hold us all back, Count. Winzengerode looked at him puzzled. Since last week, the Austrian representative has been urging for an agreement. As a big country with a huge influence on southern Germany, Austria's attitude is something that the small countries in southern Germany cannot ignore. The Baden representative also shouted, Baron Thugut is right. We are also waiting for the implementation of the agreement. The merchants in Baden heard the news of the trade negotiations and piled up their goods at the dock, waiting to be shipped to France and Austria for sale. If we delay too long here, they will probably go crazy. The Augsburg representative nodded in agreement. I think the current terms are completely acceptable. And the draft also says that the detailed terms will be renegotiated every 3 years in the future. Many things will be studied carefully at that time. Not surprisingly, the two of them were also the results of Talleyrand's bribery, and the cost was very low, only 30,000 livres per person, and they were completely taken. Of course, the terms of the agreement did not seem to be disadvantageous to Baden and Augsburg, so they were also happy to take the money, just to speed up the signing, and they would hardly have any risks. As for Bavaria, they got the most favorable terms of the agreement, and Archduke Otto was still dreaming of moving to the southern Netherlands, so he was more inclined to listen to Austria's opinions. So the negotiation site formed a situation where France, Austria, Bavaria and two small countries firmly promoted the signing of the agreement, while Württemberg and Hesse were somewhat hesitant. However, after Hesse was secretly threatened by Austria, to kick him out and let other countries sign the agreement in advance. Hesse quickly compromised. If they missed the large market of southern Germany plus France and Austria, they would probably suffer a big loss in trade, and then their national strength would fall behind rapidly. Small countries just want to gain more benefits, but they never want to be outsiders. Under the strong mediation of Austria, the countries have reached a preliminary agreement after only half a month of trade negotiations. Count Winzengrad finally relented after he was unable to survive alone and obtained France's promise to import at least 800,000 picograms of coal at market prices every year. A pico is a standard sized basket, and 1 pico of coal weighs about 20 kilograms. 800,000 picograms is 16 million kilograms. This was only a negligible number in later generations, but in the 18th century, when coal was mainly used for heating, this was basically close to the total output of all coal mines in Württemberg. For Württemberg, this is definitely a big deal. On July 1st, 1789, the Seine-Rhine trade agreement, which had a huge impact on the European trade pattern, was officially signed. The contracting countries include France, Austria, Bavaria, Salzburg, Württemberg, Augsburg, Hesse-Darmstadt, Baden. Signed together with the agreement, there are also supplementary provisions of the agreement. Shipping vessels from the signatory countries in the Seine and Rhine river basins can directly enter other countries. Although landing is not possible and locals must be hired to unload the goods, it is already a huge convenience for free trade. Paris Palace of Versailles. Queen Mary put down the war participation plan jointly submitted by Archbishop Briand and the Minister of War, Duke Broy, and looked at them with some surprise. Are you sure that France should participate in the war in the German region? Is this really in the interest of France? The two cabinet ministers nodded in unison. Of course, this was the order of His Royal Highness the Crown Prince, so they complied with the request and wrote the documents and submitted them to Her Majesty the Queen. Queen Mary asked cautiously, "So, is France ready to join the war?" Brian and Duke Broy were not very clear about the specific situation, but they still nodded firmly. "Yes, Your Majesty. The battlefield is far away from France, and the interests are large enough. We only need to send some troops to Silesia. Even no need to worry about winning or losing." Only Talleyrand, who stood aside and knew the inside story best, shrank his head and muttered in his heart, "You are still here worrying about whether you are ready. His Royal Highness the Crown Prince has already finalized everything with the Austrians, and now the Austrian army may have completed its assembly. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 311. Declare war on Prussia. No, declare war on the Dutch rebels. France must be extremely cautious about participating in the war between Prussia and Austria. Therefore, after receiving affirmative responses from several loyal ministers, Queen Mary immediately convened an enlarged meeting of the cabinet to discuss the dispatch of troops to Silesia. In addition to the Minister of Commerce, who was still negotiating a trade agreement in Munich, all cabinet ministers and senior military officials, as well as the Count of Provence, the Count of Artois and other royal families were present. 69. The seemingly serious and grand meeting actually did not have much suspense. Under the leadership of Briand, the cabinet ministers unanimously agreed to join the war. In particular, the Minister of War, the Duke of Broglie, claimed that this was a historic opportunity for France to expand its influence on the European continent. Of course, he was able to work so hard because His Royal Highness the Crown Prince promised him benefits that he could not refuse. Then he asked Berthier to conduct a military analysis to prove that the chances of supporting Austria were very high, and even if Prussia won, France would suffer minimal losses. The Count of Provence, Louis XVI's younger brother, who was not familiar with the situation, looked at the Minister of War who was speaking impassionately, frowned and asked the most critical question, "Duke Broglie, how many troops are we going to send? Will there be any financial problems?" After France still has a deficit of billions of livres. This is also the issue that Queen Mary is most concerned about, and she immediately looked at the Duke of Broglie Point before the Minister of War spoke. Talleyrand stood up and bowed slightly to the Count of Provence. My lord, it is very cost effective for our country to participate in this war financially, because His Majesty Joseph II has promised that in return for participating in the war, he will do his best to promote the signing of a trade agreement between France, Austria and the southern German countries. You may have heard the news, that is, the Seine-Rhine trade agreement. In fact, when I left Munich, the negotiations were almost over. That is to say, in the future, our products can be sold in large quantities to the South German market, and the expenses of this war can be earned back from here in the future. Duke Broglie immediately continued, and we will strictly control the scale of participation in the war. The number of troops sent in the early stage will not exceed 50,000, and the cost will not be too high. Queen Mary turned to look at the Minister of Finance. Brian had also made preparations long ago, and immediately said, Your Majesty, the current financial situation is still relatively stable. We only need to issue some public bonds to support the military expenses of 50,000 troops for 1 or 2 years. In fact, if Joseph had not used a large amount of money to carry out tax reform, the 50 to 60 million livres that had been confiscated from the Duke of Orleans would have been enough to support the French army. The biggest stone in Queen Mary's heart finally fell, and she discussed the pros and cons of participating in the war with the ministers. Seeing that everyone's opinions were surprisingly consistent, she no longer hesitated. At 5 p.m., she looked at Brian and solemnly ordered, Then, please draft the document. France will formally ally with Austria and declare war on Prussia. Joseph, who had been sitting in the corner and didn't say much, was almost choked by his saliva when he heard this. He thought to himself that his mother was really honest, taking advantage of the conflict between Prussia and Austria to fish in troubled waters and gain benefits. How can you both ally and declare war? After all this operation, you have turned Austria's affairs into France's affairs, and you can't get rid of them in the future. He hurriedly coughed and stood up, bowed to Queen Mary and said, Your Majesty, I don't think it is necessary to declare war on Prussia for the time being. Seeing the surprised looks from Queen Mary and others, Joseph explained, the current war situation is still unclear, and we should be cautious about declaring war, but our army is about to go to Silesia to fight the Prussians, which is actually a declaration of war. No, we are just going there to maintain local order at the invitation of Austria, but we will send the troops that should be sent and fight the war as we should, but there is no need to declare war. Prussia should not take the initiative to declare war on us. If the Prussians are not stupid, they will definitely pretend not to see the French army participating in the war. Declaring war is equivalent to tying France to Austria. Duke Broglie frowned and said, Your Highness, I'm afraid that the Austrian side will strongly demand that we declare war on Prussia. A sly smile flashed in Joseph's eyes. If we must declare war, then we will declare war on the rebels in the southern Netherlands. Last month they brazenly robbed our caravan. This is a blatant provocation. We must not tolerate it. The southern Netherlands robbed the French caravan? A lot of question marks suddenly appeared in the conference hall. Berthier was the first to react. Your Highness, you mean the time when the Dutch rebels attacked the logistical supplies we prepared for Austria? What? Supplies for Austria? Joseph deliberately sank his face. Those were the grain and iron products purchased by Luxembourg. It was a normal business transaction. Yes, Your Highness. I remembered it wrong. It was indeed the goods ordered by Luxembourg. Ministers such as Brian and Duke de Broglie immediately agreed with the Crown Prince's opinion. In the end, Queen Mary had to accept the advice and decided to declare war on the southern Netherlands rebels first. If Austria takes the initiative on the battlefield in the future, it will formally announce the alliance between France and Austria and declare war on Prussia. However, she had no idea that Joseph had already made plans and would never let either Prussia or Austria gain a clear advantage. As long as Prussia and Austria continued to clash, even if the fighting was not so intense, they would not be able to join forces to divide Poland. and would even show goodwill to Poland in order to win Poland's military support point. Even if Russia wanted to attack Poland in the future, Poland could avoid being attacked from both sides and concentrate on dealing with the Russian army. Even if it was still defeated in the end, it could at least resist for a few more years than in history point. While the fighting was in full swing in other parts of the European continent, France was developing its head in silence, while quietly giving the warring countries the opportunity to sell supplies. At 6 p.m., the cabinet meeting ended, and France took a key step to join Austria in the war between Prussia and Austria. Point of course, such a big thing as being involved in the war between Prussia and Austria could not be discussed in one day. Today was just the tone, and the specific details of the war still needed a long discussion at the cabinet meeting. Point however, the real plan for joining the war was formulated in the study of the Crown Prince, and then it was taken to the cabinet meeting for regularization. Point and pushed open the door of the study, and stood aside with his head bowed. Point Joseph stepped into the room, and turned to ask Talleyrand beside him, "Is everything ready in the southern Netherlands?" The latter nodded immediately, and said in a low voice, "Yes, your highness. When the time comes, Ferdinand will receive the news immediately." The Ferdinand he was talking about was the Duke of Brunswick, the commander-in-chief of the Prussian army. Chapter 312. The real goal. Joseph nodded and continued to ask, "What about Saxony? When I left Vienna, I set out for Dresden." Talleyrand said, "I must have been in contact with General Maurice now." General Maurice was the commander of the Saxon army. Joseph motioned for him to sit down on the chair. "Are all the people using it reliable, please?" "Rest assured, he was selected by the intelligence bureau and I secretly brought him to Saxony through diplomatic channels. He is an authentic Bavarian and can't even speak French." "You did a good job." Joseph smiled. "Oh, by the way, when you bribed the Austrian interior minister's assistant, the Baden negotiator and others this time, you maximized the efficiency of the funds, which is very good. So, just keep half of the income from the sale of information in the southern Netherlands and Saxony as a bonus for you and your subordinates." Joseph spoke calmly, but Talleyrand's heart tightened when he heard this. When he went to Germany to pay bribes this time, because of the difficulty, he barely made a penny. Just now, His Royal Highness the Crown Prince said, "Maximize the efficiency of funding," which is obviously what he was referring to. In other words, His Highness is likely to know exactly whether he is lining his own pockets before that. "I went to the United States, Russia and other places to earn bribes myself." He swallowed hard, and cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He was struggling in his mind on how to admit his mistake to His Royal Highness the Crown Prince, but he heard Joseph say, "Bribery is often involved in the diplomatic field. You only need to report it when you come back. Can you get help from foreign governments? You have put in the effort to get the money, and you can keep part of it as a bonus. Of course, you must not interfere with your work just to make money." Talleyrand was startled. Does His Highness mean that he should accept bribes from abroad in the future? As long as he hands over the money he receives, he can get a proportional share of the bonus. He secretly glanced at Joseph and saw that the latter's expression was very serious, and he was immediately overjoyed. From now on, he no longer had to worry about getting money. Then he remembered the proceeds from this sale of information and couldn't hide the smile on his face. According to the instructions of His Royal Highness the Crown Prince, he first sent people to the southern Netherlands and sold the news that the main force of the Austrian army in Luxembourg has withdrawn to Vienna to the Duke of Brunswick in Prussia for 16,000 florins. Later, his people sold the news to Saxony that Austria was gathering an army to attack Silesia and received 20,000 florins. This totaled 90,000 livres. His Royal Highness the Crown Prince gave him half as a bonus with a wave of his hand. How could he not be overjoyed? As expected, being loyal to His Highness is the most correct decision I have ever made in my life. Talleyrand struggled to pull his consciousness out of the ocean of the river, expressed his loyalty to Joseph, and then continued to talk about business. "Your Highness, when I left Vienna, Leopold II summoned. He told me that he hoped France could exert influence on Russia to ensure that they would not interfere in the war in Silesia." Joseph nodded slightly and said to himself that Leopold II had indeed rich political experience, and almost immediately considered the Russian issue. Catherine II has been committed to winning over Prussia and Austria to carve up Poland, so she definitely does not want the two countries to fight. But how can I convince her to stand by and watch? Joseph thought for a long time, then looked at Talleyrand and said, "It seems that you have to go to Petersburg again. After you see the Tsar, you will say this." After explaining it carefully, Joseph added, "I will also try to cooperate with you, and you have to adapt accordingly, based on the news you heard. Yes, Your Highness, I will not let you down." After Talleyrand left, the Duke of Broglie and Berthier, the Minister of War, came to the Crown Prince's study again. The two presented the drafted troop dispatch plan to Joseph, and the Chief of General Staff explained, "Your Highness, according to your instructions, a 35,000 strong army will be sent to Austria. The corps consists of the Legion of Lorraine, the Legion of Champagne, the Legion of the Rhine, and some soldiers from the north, who can speak German, were selected." The Duke of Broglie seemed a little nervous, although His Royal Highness the Crown Prince had previously said that he would decide to go to the Austrian troops in exchange for his support for sending troops. However, the ones he picked out were basically legions that were related to him, and he was afraid that His Highness would have objections. However, Joseph nodded and smiled. "Very good, these troops are very suitable." He originally wanted to throw the old army to Austria. If he can win a few battles, he will use this as an excuse to ask for benefits from Vienna. If he loses, it will be beneficial and harmless to kill a group of hereditary military nobles. These capable talents in the old army have already applied for transfer. The Guards Corps is gone, and those left behind are either diehards or losers. The Duke of Broglie felt relieved when he heard this, and motioned to Berthier to continue. The latter hurriedly said, "Your Highness, according to the latest news sent back from Vienna, the Austrian army will complete its deployment in about 3 weeks and officially launch the attack. The mobilization of an army of nearly 100,000 people is an extremely cumbersome matter. It is not like in the game, where you can click and leave with just a click of the mouse. In reality, before attacking a certain area, you must first make a strategic layout and calculate the enemy's traffic arteries, logistical supply lines, and advancing and retreating routes. Then rationally move the army to the position that can threaten these points the fastest, while also paying attention to concealment. During the military mobilization, logistical supplies must also follow, and the domestic personnel and material mobilization must also keep up. Only when all these are in place can the main force begin to attack. Therefore, Austria was able to complete this series of preparations in about 1.5 months. Which was already a relatively fast speed. Joseph asked the most concerned question, "What about the Guards Corps, Your Highness? The military station north of Verdun has been built, and the supplies can be replenished within a week." The Chief of Staff said, "In order to facilitate supplies, a wooden track from Lorraine to Verdun has even been built, but it will take more than 3 months to complete. At present, the 1st and 2nd Guards Corps, as well as the Moulin Corps, have a total of nearly 20,000 people, and have been assembled, and are ready to fight at any time." Joseph's eyes flashed with a smile. He didn't care about the Silesian War at all. The South Netherlands was his focus. All of France's most powerful Guards Corps were deployed here, waiting for the Silesia to fight to the death, and the Prussian army in the South Netherlands to give a huge surprise to the Wurmser army, stationed in Luxembourg. By then, Joseph II would not be able to withdraw any available troops, so he could only ask for help from France, which was closest to the South Netherlands. For this reason, Joseph also gave the Duke of Brunswick a reminder to let him notice the lack of manpower in the Austrian army in Luxembourg. Warm tips: share this website. C2 Reading to Facebook. Please move your fingers so that we can continue to operate. Chapter 313 Lion's Last Chance. When the French army defeated the rebels in Brabant, Prussia would certainly not accept the result of Austria's dominance in the southern Netherlands, so it would definitely allocate some troops to support the southern Netherlands. Joseph had even made preparations to create signs of the French army's lack of stamina there, so that the Prussians would feel that they could give it another try. As the Prussian army was transferred to the southern Netherlands, the troops in Silesia would inevitably decrease, and the pressure on the Austrian army there would also be reduced. Joseph II felt the support of the war in the southern Netherlands in the direction of Silesia, and would inevitably encourage the French army to continue to contain the Prussians there. At this time, the French military presence in the southern Netherlands was equivalent to being tacitly approved by Austria. During the battle between the French and Prussians, the battlefield would expand to a place that was not under the control of Austria. Joseph II would even hope that the French army would actually control a larger area, and it would be best if the battlefield could be extended to Heir, which is Prussia's territory adjacent to the northeast of the southern Netherlands. Of course, Joseph would not be stupid enough to be the first to provoke Prussia endlessly. In fact, he did not even want to get involved in the Flemish region of the southern Netherlands. As long as he could get Wallonia, the French-speaking area in the southeast of the southern Netherlands, he would have achieved his strategic goal. People in Wallonia basically speak French, are naturally pro-French, and have almost no difficulty in management. Most importantly, Wallonia is an important coal-producing area in Europe. Taking it here can provide strong support for France's industrial revolution. In addition, Wallonia is also adjacent to Luxembourg, which has a large number of excellent iron ore, and was ruled by France 80 years ago. The war in the southern Netherlands can easily spread here. When the war between Prussia and Austria is over, Wallonia and Luxembourg will be full of French soldiers, and even the bureaucratic system will have taken on the shape of France. At that time, how to calculate the ownership of these places will be discussed by France and Austria. As for the Flemish region in the north of the southern Netherlands, although it can control the estuary of the Rhine, it is still a hot potato at present. First of all, most of the population in the Flemish region speaks Dutch, which will be very difficult to rule. The Austrian rule here encountered the Brabant uprising as a lesson. Secondly, the British attach great importance to the estuary of the Rhine, because nearly half of their sales of goods to the European continent are from here. By the way, the port of Le Havre, which is the estuary of the Seine River, is equally important. Therefore, the British will never accept that France, which they have always been hostile to, controls their trade lifeline and the vast German market. For this reason, they will not hesitate to declare war on France. Historically, the core reason why Britain devoted all its efforts to the Second Anti-French Alliance was that France occupied the southern Netherlands at that time and was determined to control the Rhine waterway regardless of the previous agreement. Joseph's current strategic focus is on domestic industrial construction to strengthen national strength as soon as possible, and then use the dividends of industrial development to fill the huge fiscal deficit. Before that, he never wanted to compete with the British. After all, the latter is still the most powerful country in Europe. Therefore, it is best for the northern part of the southern Netherlands to remain in the hands of the Austrians for the time being. These are Joseph's strategic designs for France and the European direction. As for making a big move in Europe, it will have to wait until France's economy develops. War actually depends on the national foundation, and the economy is the most important one. It was already past 10 o'clock in the evening when the Minister of War and the Chief of Staff reported on the French army's preparations for war. Joseph roughly calculated the time according to what Berthier had just said. It will take about a month for Austria to launch an attack on Silesia, and for the war to spread to the southern Netherlands. He sorted out the things at hand and told Demon, who was standing at the door, "Please prepare, we will go to Lyon early tomorrow morning." "Yes, your highness." A month is enough to go to Lyon and return. Joseph knew that after the Seine-Rhine trade agreement was signed, a very broad market would appear in front of France. So far, the crucial automatic loom has not been fully rolled out. This is a waste of historical opportunities. In fact, the automatic loom has begun mass production. Mirabeau shipped 30 or 40 of them to Lyon a while ago. However, the slow spread of information in this era, coupled with the conservative thinking of Lyon factory owners, did not dare to invest huge sums of money to try, resulting in the automatic loom not even making a splash. Joseph rubbed his sore shoulders and sighed in his heart. He really couldn't do anything without himself. 7 days later, Joseph looked out the window at the Rhone River dock, where there were piles of textiles everywhere, and workers were busy like ants, moving the goods onto the ship. There were still vehicles around to bring more cloth and clothes, and the people on the car shouted loudly, calling the dock workers to unload the goods. It was also a prosperous French textile center, however. Joseph knew very well that this place was far behind the developed British textile industry. In fact, if it weren't for the fact that he had tricked the British and revised the Treaty of Eden, which allowed Lion to breathe a sigh of relief, this place would have been full of bankrupt workshops and unemployed workers, full of desolation and ruin. Of course, now it is just a sigh of relief. France lacks colonies to dump goods and has no large cotton and wool production bases, so it is naturally inferior to the British in terms of cost and sales. Therefore, if France wants to get a piece of the pie in the textile industry, which has the largest sales volume, it can only work hard in the production link. Although the British are still the world's South Bowen in this area, the application of automatic looms and steam engines has given France a rare opportunity. Joseph's convoy drove all the way to the outside of the Royal Square, and the surrounding area suddenly became lively. The municipal commissioner and the president of the Chamber of Commerce led hundreds of officials and factory owners to stand respectfully on both sides of the road to welcome His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. This was also what Joseph ordered in advance, asking them to wait in the square, otherwise it would take another half a day to greet them from outside the city and then come here. After a routine salute and greeting, Joseph, accompanied by music and cheers, pushed through the crowd and went straight to the high platform in the center of the square. As he raised his hand to signal, the surroundings soon became quiet. He looked around and wasted no time, shouting, "Now, it is Lion's last chance. According to the Treaty of Eden, starting from the end of next year, tariffs on British textiles will be greatly reduced. According to Lion's current costs, it will lose all domestic markets by then." Chapter 314 Textile Revolution. Everyone looked at each other in surprise on the Royal Square. They had originally planned that the Crown Prince would attend a banquet and then a dance after coming to Lion, and they would have to start talking about business tomorrow. Unexpectedly, His Highness did nothing but threw out such a powerful statement as Lion is finished right away. However, most people here are engaged in textile related industries. Although they all think that the Crown Prince's words are a bit too much, it is an indisputable fact that the industry will face fierce competition from the British 69 book bar. Joseph paused and pointed to the automatic loom placed beside him. "The only thing we can compete with the British at the moment is production efficiency. You should have heard that the weaving speed of this automatic loom is more than 10 times that of a manual loom. With continuous improvements in the future, the efficiency will continue to improve. This means that factories using automatic looms only need to employ 1/10 of the workers in the past." He actually stole the concept here. Although the automatic loom is efficient, it still requires a large number of workers to operate it, and at most it can reduce a quarter of the workers. Of course, the output of woven cloth will increase significantly. Joseph continued, "Only in this way can our textiles be close to the cost of the British." However, the British have already started using automatic looms a few years ago. That is to say, their costs will be even lower in the future, and our products will be completely cut off from sales. The British automatic looms are a trade secret, and the French side is not clear about the specific situation. At this time, everyone became nervous when they heard His Royal Highness the Crown Prince say this. In fact, Mirabeau's people had promoted automatic looms to them before, but they didn't beat them hard like Joseph, so no one cared at all. Now they realized that the situation is already very serious. Seeing that the atmosphere was almost set, Joseph changed the subject. "The good news is that there are not many automatic looms in the UK at present, and they are all hydraulically driven. This is what I just said, last chance. If Lion starts using automatic looms on a large scale from now on, coupled with our latest high pressure steam engine drive, it will be able to surpass Britain in production efficiency and regain the market we deserve." What he didn't say was that when automatic looms are rolled out in large quantities, they can also promote the improvement of steam engines and form a positive cycle. The factory owners present whispered for a long time. At the request of everyone, Boyer, president of the Lion Chamber of Commerce, stood up and saluted Joseph on his chest, saying, "Your Highness, in fact, everyone knows that the performance of automatic looms is advanced, but this thing is too expensive. The loom plus the matching steam engine requires more than 16,000 livres. And if you want to form a scale, you have to buy at least 3 looms. There are also links such as training workers and trial production, which cost a lot of money. He looked behind him. Most people here find it difficult to come up with such a large sum of money. And even if they raise enough money to buy the loom, if there is a problem with the raw materials or the market, resulting in poor sales, the huge investment before will quickly bankrupt the factory. Joseph nodded slightly when he heard this. He knew that what Boyle said were all very realistic problems in the 18th century, due to insufficient technical verification, incorrect information, or lack of supporting policies. The use of new technologies was a very risky thing. Even in the birthplace of new technologies in Europe, such as Britain, it took more than 10 years to popularize automatic looms, and they were still driven by water wheels. Automatic looms driven by steam engines did not become popular in Britain until the 19th century. In a similar situation, Watt had completed the improvement of the steam engine for nearly 10 years, but the annual sales were less than 20 units in France. It was all thanks to Joseph using the small parish bank to lend money to rural areas so that they could buy pumps for irrigation, which promoted the sales of steam engines. Otherwise, Murdoch's technology iteration would not be so fast. However, as a person who has experienced the capital era in later generations, Joseph has a mature countermeasure for this. He raised his hand to signal everyone to be quiet and said loudly, "The government has made preparations for everyone's concerns. That's the investment insurance business." The people in the square looked at each other again. They understood the word insurance, but when investment was added in front, no one knew what was going on. Although the insurance industry had already appeared in the 17th century, it has only developed to a few types such as marine insurance, fire insurance and life insurance. Joseph smiled and explained to everyone, the French commercial insurance company can accept insurance for investment in automatic looms. After that, the company will verify the capital and operating conditions of the factory and send salesmen to supervise production. And once the insured factory goes bankrupt, the insurance company will check the factory's operations and account conditions. As long as there is no fraud, investors can get 80% of the investment amount. Of course, the corresponding assets of the factory will be taken over by the insurance company. To be honest, this type of insurance is extremely risky for insurance companies, but Joseph has sufficient confidence in the automatic loom. As long as the factory operates normally, it should not go bankrupt. To take a step back, if the business collapses, he can also recover the factory assets as an insurance company, merge it into a large-scale textile company, and continue to operate in the mode of government investment. For the technological revolution in France's textile industry, the risks involved could only be borne by the newly established French commercial insurance company under the French Reserve Bank. The factory owners present immediately began to whisper excitedly, "If you only lose 20%, you can give it a try. It's really helpful that there is such insurance. I just don't know if the insurance company can afford to pay if something goes wrong." I heard Mr. Duran mention that this is a company in which the Reserve Bank of France has a stake. There should be no problem with funding. That's great. I've long wanted to buy some automatic looms to try. Do you want to partner with me? Joseph struck while the iron was hot. Perhaps you have heard the news that we have signed trade agreements with Austria and the 6 South German countries. In the future, textiles from Lyon can be sold directly to South Germany through the Rhine River. The tariff will be at least the same as that of British goods, and even lower in countries such as Baden. A burst of exclamations instantly erupted in the square. Being able to enter a market as large as South Germany is definitely a major benefit to the French textile industry, and future sales are likely to increase significantly. Joseph continued to stimulate everyone. In addition, we have obtained a new source of wool in the Pacific Ocean. The production can reach more than £1 million, and it will even exceed £2 million next year. The price is only half of the wool currently on the market. In fact, he said it a bit modestly, New Zealand is a paradise for sheep herders. If the number of sheep flocks increases, the output can even be higher than that of the United Kingdom. Chapter 315 Smoke of War. For a moment, the factory owner's present became even more excited. With the market, raw materials, the latest technology, and insurance companies to back up the investment, this business can definitely be done. Of course, Joseph also knew that, although these people were excited, when it came to investing livres, most of them would still shrink back until the first person to try it out really made money, and then they would follow suit. 69. Book bar 69. So Joseph then proposed an incentive plan in order to encourage everyone to use new technologies. Factories that invest in automatic looms within 3 months will be able to enjoy a 50% tax reduction policy for 3 years. Factories that invest within 5 months can enjoy a 35% tax reduction. In addition, for investors with insufficient funds, the precision machinery factory can also provide rental services. You only need to invest 2,000 livres to rent an automatic loom for 1 year. The French precision machinery factory is a new factory separated from the Royal Ordnance Factory. After all, the Ordnance Factory should focus on the production of weapons, and it is not a good idea to always let them make looms. It happened that the Ordnance Factory recruited a group of craftsmen to produce automatic looms, so Joseph simply invested some money to separate these people and set up a new company. In the future, it can also produce precision products such as lathes and boring machines, which can play a very important role in promoting industrial productivity. As for the leasing of automatic looms, Joseph directly asked the Minister of Industry to apply for financial subsidies. For each loom rented out, the French Treasury will subsidize the precision machinery factory with 4,000 livres. The price of an automatic loom is 5,800 livres. In other words, the precision machinery factory does not take any risks in renting looms. Now there are many more textile owners who are really determined to try automatic looms. To invest in 3 automatic looms, you only need to take out 36,000 livres, and 30,000 livres are used to buy steam engines. Steam engines are very valuable. Many villages are looking for second-hand steam engines for irrigation, which can be easily sold. With a 50% tax reduction, there is really no need to wait and see. You know, there will be no tax reduction benefits in 5 months. Some smart factory owners have already formed groups of 3 or 5 to discuss investing in automatic looms together. The larger the capital scale, the more effectively it can reduce costs. Although there is no complete set of business operation theory, these people have actually opened factories of experience and are all skilled capitalists. After the policy briefing, Joseph immediately took the Lyon Municipal Commissioner and the President of the Chamber of Commerce to inspect the large-scale textile factories in Lyon. For the best performing ones among them, he not only provided loan support. Well, the French Reserve Bank was very fast in lending. After seeing the note approved by the Crown Prince, he even personally taught the operators of several factories advanced concepts such as brand building, promotion, and cultivation of sales networks for the French textile industry. He almost took care of everything for the factory owners, except for chewing it up and feeding it to them. Compared with their British counterparts who relied on their own talents to work hard, the textile owners in Lyon were so happy. This if we still can't catch up with the British, it would be unjust. 4 days later, Joseph looked at the more than 30 application forms for the new automatic loom factory on the table with satisfaction, and couldn't help but let out a long sigh. It seemed that his trip to Lyon could end. The specific implementation work later would naturally be taken over by Mirabeau's people. He had already decided on the general framework, so basically there would be no problems. However, when Joseph was about to leave for Verdun in the morning, he heard a faint noise coming from outside the window. He opened the window in surprise and saw that the wall of the villa where he stayed was crowded with people. His guards and Lyon police were shouting and trying to disperse those people. Before he asked, Emin hurried over and bowed his head and said, "Your Highness, those are textile workers in Lyon. They seem to have heard that automatic looms can reduce the number of employees in the factory by 90%, so they came to petition you." Joseph couldn't help but hold his forehead. The workers were worried about losing their jobs. It was also his fault for bragging too much. In this era, workers are basically moonlighters. If they lose their jobs, their families will go hungry immediately. He suddenly felt a headache. Although the workers' worries were unnecessary, on the one hand, The effect of automatic looms in reducing the use of manpower was not so exaggerated, and on the other hand, automatic looms could increase the sales of textiles in Lyon, which was equivalent to making the cake bigger. By then, the factory would definitely be expanded on a large scale, and the number of people required would only be more than now, not less, but it was difficult to explain this to the workers clearly. Joseph thought for a while and told Emmon, "Please tell Major Xode that there is no need to disperse the crowd." Emmon hesitated for a moment, but still stroked his chest and said, "Yes, Your Highness." Soon, Joseph came to the gate of the villa. Someone shouted, "It's His Royal Highness the Crown Prince." Hundreds of Lyon workers who were separated by the police outside the wall suddenly fell silent. Joseph looked around, climbed onto the roof of a carriage parked in front of the gate, and shouted to the ragged and anxious textile workers, "I understand your concerns, but I can guarantee that you will never lose your job because of the automatic looms." A brave worker squeezed forward and said nervously, "Your Highness, but my boss said that when the automatic looms arrive, more than half of the people will be fired." Joseph immediately said, "The government plans to build a textile processing base in Lyon and expand their own river terminal, which will require a large number of manpower. Unemployed textile workers will receive job opportunities first. The wages will not be lower than your original level. In addition, the laying of wooden tracks in large cities near Lyon will soon begin, again with priority given to recruiting unemployed workers. After these projects, large companies such as the Lyon River Transport Company and the Lyon Gas Lighting Company will be established. The government will also launch many large projects to promote the construction of Lyon. In short, there will be more and more places that need manpower in the future, and we will not need it at all." Afraid of not having a job, the textile workers who came to petition immediately started whispering, but their eyes clearly showed concern and disbelief. Joseph smiled again and said, "Every 2 months from now on, I will personally send people to count the unemployment rate in Lyon. If the unemployment rate is too high, I will let the government fund to help unemployed families go to Saint-Etienne or Nogent. Everyone, you must have heard of the industrial development zone over there. There are factories everywhere, as well as employee dormitories and schools, so work is not a problem." Oh, what I just said will be issued as an official announcement from the city government soon. Please rest assured that hundreds of people around suddenly fell silent, not only because His Royal Highness the Crown Prince had solved the unemployment problem they were extremely worried about, but what surprised them was that the Crown Prince was so considerate of them and so approachable. This is completely different from the impression of the royal family in their minds. Joseph knew how much riots Lyon workers had caused due to unemployment in history, so he would not take it lightly. For a moment, someone shouted first, "Long live His Royal Highness the Crown Prince." Others were reminded and bowed to Joseph, shouting together, "Long live His Royal Highness the Crown Prince." "Thank you, Your Majesty the merciful Crown Prince. You must be sent by God to save us." Joseph was a little sad when he saw this. He just gave these simple lower class people a chance to work 14 hours a day so that they could buy black bread for their families, which made them so grateful. Perhaps, as the Crown Prince, he should do more for such poor people. South Asia. Southern Peninsula. India. Outside Calicut port, more than a dozen Arabian-style carriages were driving on the rugged and bumpy roads. From time to time, dark-skinned locals would quickly pass the carriages from both sides of the road with bare feet. The Marquis de Lafayette did not urge the coachman to speed up because his but could no longer withstand bigger bumps. In fact, he now regretted not listening to the guide's advice and taking the domed sedan carried by the locals, but he quickly put this little unhappiness behind him and even felt that the humid and hot weather and the bad roads were so lovely. Because this will be the starting point for his rapid rise. Unlike more than 10 years when he went to the United States without permission to participate in the War of Independence, his visit to India this time was commissioned by His Majesty the King, so he would never win a lot of battles and be criticized. When he returned to France. The royal family promised him that, as long as he helped miss or defeat the British, just as he had done in North America, he would be able to ascend to the high position of assistant to the Minister of War. That was the power he dreamed of. Those military nobles who had laughed at him and ostracized him before would have to treat him with respect and even rush to fawn over him. Thinking of this, a strong sense of excitement surged in his heart, as if he was about to go on a date with his favorite lady. He looked at the tropical jungle in the distance, quickly gathered his thoughts, and began to think about how to quickly open up the situation during this trip to Missile Point. In fact, His Royal Highness the Crown Prince had compiled a series of strategies for him before leaving, but it was difficult for him to believe the effectiveness of the methods designed by a young man who had never been to India. He recalled the Crown Prince's plans and whispered to himself, "After all, I have to act according to my own circumstances. Fortunately, this is a kingdom with a population of nearly 20 million. Even if it is consumed slowly, it can still kill the East India Company guys." Yes, Britain's political, military and trade management in India are now fully entrusted to the East India Company, which only needs to pay a share to the British government every year for cost-saving reasons. The East India Company had less than 3,000 troops in India. In peacetime, it mainly relied on Indian soldiers recruited from Indian states. The latter usually has 40,000 to 80,000 people depending on needs. In other words, there are only 3,000 enemy troops with strong combat effectiveness. Lafayette couldn't help but smile when he thought of this. This was simply a gift from God to himself. Not only was the kingdom of Mysore strong, but starting from Tipu Sultan's fathers, it had trained nearly 60,000 powerful warriors according to the European model army. Moreover, Mysore has a unified ethnic group and religion, relatively open politics, and its overall national strength is much better than that of the surrounding princely states. If this trip to India goes well, maybe he can return to Paris before the end of the year and be promoted to assistant to the Minister of War after more than 10 days of torrential rain and intense sunshine in the tropical climate. Lafayette's motorcade finally arrived in Mysore, the capital of Mysore. Tipu Sultan gave him a very grand welcome ceremony. In fact, France had sent envoys to Mysore before, but it did not provide much support. It even had certain interests in Travancore, which did not deal with Mysore. This time the French are obviously going to really help Mysore. The messenger who came to contact in advance said that the person coming to Mysore this time was the famous French general, Marquis Lafayette, who had defeated the British in the United States. At the same time, the latter would bring troops and a large amount of weapons in the open Arabian palace. Lafayette glanced at the food in front of him, which was enough for 10 people to eat for 3 days, but did not do it. Instead, he turned his head to look at Tipu Sultan and said directly, "Your Majesty, how are you going to deal with the Travancore seizure of the Mysore fortress this time?" The Indian man next to him immediately translated simultaneously. Tipu Sultan had learned that France had decided to give up its interests in Travancore, so he did not shy away. "Dear General, I have ordered the army to assemble and attack the Travancore people who are overconfident in 3 months. Lafayette smiled and immediately said what the prince had repeatedly told him, "Your Majesty, if you want to win, you must always keep your eyes on the British. Although they are not many in number, they are your real enemies." Tipu Sultan was startled, then nodded slightly. The reason why Mysore failed in the first 2 wars was that the enemy army was commanded by the British. He looked at Lafayette. "So what is your suggestion?" "Drive the British in Canada and Malabar into the sea as quickly as possible, and then concentrate the forces to deal with Manita," Lafayette said. "I brought 300 elite soldiers and a large number of craftsmen this time, as well as 13,000 flintlocks and 30 cannons. I will help you defeat all enemies in one fell swoop." Prussia. Potsdam, Sanssouci Palace. William II waved the secret report in his hand angrily and shouted to Prince Heinrich, "The despicable Austrians actually want to sneak attack Silesia." The report in his hand was just sent by Saxony, which said that Austria had gathered nearly 100,000 troops and could launch an attack on Silesia at any time. Prince Heinrich looked at the king who was walking around in anger and sighed in his heart. If only his brother was still alive. No, if his brother was still alive, the Austrians would not dare to take Silesia at all. He is Frederick the Great's younger brother, the uncle of the current Prussian King William II, and the most influential person in Prussian politics. "Your Majesty, you don't need to worry. Prince Heinrich seemed very calm. Since we have received intelligence in advance, we can quickly mobilize troops and take the opportunity to severely damage the Austrians, and it is not impossible to even seize part of Moravia. Chapter 316, the Fourth Silesian War. Yes, the war has just begun. William II slammed the table beside him. The Austrians have attacked Silesia many times before, but they have always been defeated. This time will be no exception. Even, they will taste the bitter fruit of Leuthen again. He was talking about the Battle of Leuthen, which was a fierce battle between Austria and Frederick the Great's Prussian army during the 7 Years' War. When Austria tried to retake Silesia Point that time, Frederick used all his military talents, using only a little more than half of Austria's troops, and through wonderful tactical command, he defeated the Austrians miserably. 22,000 of the 90,000 Austrian troops were directly killed, and 14,000 were captured. Later, the Austrian defenders in Breslau were affected, and surrendered almost without a fight, and gave Frederick another 17,000 prisoners after this battle. Prussia completely confirmed its ownership of Silesia, which can be regarded as a peak of Frederick the Great. Battle of Leuthen Point. However, William II overlooked that Prussia no longer had a military warrior like Frederick the Great. This book was first published in Book Bar, providing you with a reading experience without wrong chapters and out of order chapters. Moreover, after Frederick's death, Prussia's military was slack, and the junker nobles began to become lax, and the overall combat effectiveness dropped by more than one level compared to Frederick the Great. Although Prince Heinrich knew that it would be difficult for Prussia to replicate the glory of the Battle of Leuthen, he could not affect the morale of His Majesty the King at this time, so he also clenched his fists. Yes, Your Majesty, we will teach the weak Austrians a lesson again. After saying words to encourage the army, he immediately mentioned the specific plan. Your Majesty, we must use this time before the Austrians attack to make full preparations. I suggest that we should immediately form an alliance with Saxony to deal with the Austrians and Hanover. William II added, as well as Hesse-Kassel and Mecklenburg, we need to gather an army that will shock Austria. Prince Heinrich was startled when he heard this. Saxony is adjacent to the Silesia region, so it is not surprising that it participated in this war, but His Majesty the King wants to bring in the British. In fact, William II was able to say this with some confidence. Hanover is actually a British enclave in the German region, and King George III of the United Kingdom is the Elector of Hanover. Britain has always been committed to weakening the power of Austria and France with the help of Prussia, so it is very likely that Hanover can be persuaded to join the war. Hesse-Kassel is different from Hesse-Darmstadt, which joined the Seine-Rhine trade agreement. It belongs to Lower Hesse and is politically pro-Prussia. Mecklenburg is right next to Prussia and dares not disobey Prussia's demands. As long as these two countries give some benefits, they should be able to join the coalition. Your strategy is very good, Your Majesty. Prince Heinrich praised and continued, before we use diplomatic means, we should do two things. First, immediately send General Driesen and General Krokov to lead the guards to Liegnitz and Ratiba to garrison, and try to delay the Austrians' offensive in the early stages of the war, and wait for our main forces to complete the assembly. Second, recall the Duke of Brunswick as soon as possible. His command will be the key to our victory. William II was not very good at war. He just pretended to think seriously when he heard it, and then handed over the military affairs to Prince Heinrich for specific implementation. However, when the latter was about to salute and leave, he saw William II's manservant walking quickly, bowing his head, and handing an urgent report to the king. William II opened the letter and quickly scanned it, frowning, and said to his uncle, it was sent by the Duke of Brunswick. He found that the Austrians had transferred the troops from the South Netherlands back to their homeland. Luxembourg currently has less than 5,000 troops, so he is preparing to launch a general attack on the Austrian army in the next few days. But you just said that you need him to return to Silesia, so, Prince Heinrich pondered for a moment, then nodded and said, Your Majesty, perhaps the Duke of Brunswick is right. The achievements that his 20,000 soldiers can achieve in the South Netherlands will be far greater than the role of him rushing back to Silesia. He will be able to completely cut off Austria's control over the wealthy South Netherlands, and at the same time, he will win a beautiful victory before the battle in Silesia breaks out. This will be a great encouragement for our soldiers in Silesia. Before that, we only need to defend the two fortresses in the west and south of Silesia, and wait for the Duke of Brunswick to return in triumph. His 20,000 troops plus the Dutch army will not take too much time to deal with the 5,000 defenders of Luxembourg, but William II was still a little hesitant. Prince Heinrich took 2 steps forward and whispered, "Your Majesty, if we can drive the Austrians out of the southern Netherlands, if our army is in a bad situation in Silesia, we can use the southern Netherlands as a bargaining chip." The southern Netherlands is Austria's only outlet to the Atlantic Ocean. In terms of economy, it is also relatively developed due to overseas trade. Its area is comparable to that of Silesia, and at least half of Silesia can be exchanged. William II also fell into thought, if we can influence the southern Netherlands, Britain will also do more to support our battle in Silesia. Britain regards the Low Countries as a springboard for the European countries to advance to the Atlantic Ocean, and also a strategic location that can threaten Britain, so it has always regarded this place as a strategic focus. Note 1. If Prussia has a military presence in the southern Netherlands, then Britain will definitely be willing to exchange lucrative interests, such as sending troops to participate in the Silesia War. But he immediately became a little worried and said, "But who will command the Silesia battlefield? Or, dear uncle, you can show your former glory again." Prince Heinrich once followed Frederick the Great to fight north and south, participated in the Silesian War and the 7 Years' War, and was also a fierce general. Prince Heinrich thought for a moment, but shook his head and said, "Your Majesty, I'm really not young anymore. Perhaps we can transfer the Duke of Brunswick back to Silesia and let Marquis Wallstatt lead the army of the southern Netherlands. There are very few Austrians there, and he is enough to deal with it." The Marquis Wallstatt he mentioned as Blücher, who is currently the deputy of the Duke of Brunswick and the Prussian Marshal who will emerge in the anti-French alliance in the future. Kregnitz, northwest Austria. This is the only way to the Nitz fortress on the southwest side of Silesia. Beside the Goat Trail, General Dagobert Sigmund von Worms, the commander of the Austrian front army, put down his telescope and signaled his staff to speed up the march. A moment later, dense drumbeats sounded in the several kilometer long queue beside him, and the soldiers' pace suddenly accelerated a bit. General Worms knew very well that the marching speed of the Austrian army was almost equivalent to the outcome of the battle. If they could reach Silesia one day earlier, they could capture more land before the Prussians were prepared. Then, he turned his head and looked at the hazy white thin line behind the queue. That was the French reinforcement. Not only did the French march slowly, but they were also very impressive, as if they were here to save Austria. Only 30,000 soldiers. General Worms sighed in dissatisfaction. This will reduce our original force advantage by half. According to the original agreement, the French would send at least 50,000 troops to support Austria, and until the Austrian army began to march towards Silesia, only 30,000 French troops arrived. General Neuendorf, the cavalry commander, also shook his head. France's financial situation is very bad. It is said that they have not even been able to gather the logistical supplies for 50,000 soldiers, so they can only send troops in batches. I heard from Vienna that, in order to urge the French, His Majesty the Emperor has allocated 400,000 florins of military funds for them to purchase supplies. If nothing unexpected happens, the rest of the French army will be able to join the battle in half a month. Half a month. General Worms curled his lips slightly. In half a month, we may have broken through Breslau, and those French people can just be used as an embellishment for our entry ceremony. Breslau is the capital of Silesia. It is located in the heart of Silesia, and is also a strategic location that controls the north-south passage of Silesia. It can be said that, if this place is captured, the victory of the entire Silesia can basically be established. Of course, the Austrians also occupied Breslau in history, and then they were beaten up by the military genius Frederick the Great and drove back to Bohemia. But now the Austrians all tacitly believe that without Frederick, Prussia will no longer be able to stop themselves from avenging the shame of the failure of the previous 3 Silesian wars. As the two were talking, they saw 2 cavalrymen galloping from the northeast. They pulled the reins not far from them and reported loudly, "General, our vanguard has crossed the Liegnitz border, and no Prussian army has been found yet." General Worms was secretly delighted. It seemed that, as predicted before the war, this would be a surprise attack that would catch the Prussians off guard. General Neuendorf came over and said, "Should we report the situation here to Marshal Lacy? The main force he leads should be 1 day away from here, General." Wurmtz glanced at his mighty vanguard troops, including 25,000 Austrian troops, 10,000 French troops and 3,000 Bavarian troops. A powerful army of nearly 40,000 people broke into the undefended Silesia. Perhaps the battle would have been basically over before Marshal Lacy's main force arrived. He immediately shook his head. "You see, there are no Prussians here at all, but the fighter planes never wait for us. While we were waiting for the Marshal, the enemy might have already discovered something was wrong, General." Neuendorf frowned. "What is your plan?" "Speed up the march and deploy troops on both sides of the Liegnitz fortress," General Wurmtz said confidently. "On one side, cut off their connection with Breslau, and on the other side, beware of the Saxons. The west side of Liegnitz is Görlitz in Saxony, and the east side is close to Breslau. It is not only a bridgehead for attacking Silesia, but also a threat to Saxony." After occupying it, General Neuendorf hesitated for a moment, and finally nodded. "Your deployment is reasonable, but I think it is still necessary to report to Marshal Lacy." "Yes, reporting military intelligence is necessary, and we should speed up the pace of capturing Liegnitz." At noon the next day, the vanguard of the Austrian coalition forces, which had been marching all the way, could already see the Liegnitz fortress from a distance. When the French at the end of the team finally arrived at the front line, General Wurmtz barely allowed the troops to rest. He immediately followed his pre-planned plan and sent the Bavarian army and 5,000 Austrian troops to the west to defend Saxony, while he led the main Austrian force and the French. The army stormed Liegnitz from the east. Although the French like to show off, and their movements are a bit slow, Wurmtz knows that their combat effectiveness is still very good. At least not worse than the Austrian army. In the evening, the surveying and mapping team sent the topographic map near Liegnitz fortress to General Wurmtz's tent. Yes, although Austria has controlled Silesia for more than 100 years, it did not even conduct detailed topographic mapping. It was not until after being beaten by Frederick the Great that it realized that it was not as familiar with Silesia as the Prussians in front of the battlefield map. Wurmtz pointed to a high ground northeast of Liegnitz and said to the French commander General Kellerman, "Your Majesty General, I will ask you to lead your troops to garrison here early tomorrow morning." He pointed to a gentle slope next to the fortress. "I will lead the main force to deploy here and set up artillery positions here. You can directly bombard the fortress from here. When the Prussian defenders are driven out by artillery, I will hold them in front, and General, you will rush out from behind them from a high position. You will definitely defeat the Prussians in one fell swoop." He turned to ask the staff officer beside him, "How many soldiers are there defending Liegnitz?" "According to our previous intelligence, there should be no more than 8,000 people, General." "Very good." Wurmtz nodded. "Victory will definitely belong to us." Before dawn the next day, the French army put away their tents and took advantage of the first ray of morning light to rush northeast of Liegnitz. However, as soon as they walked less than 3 kilometers, the cavalry in charge of reconnaissance in front hurriedly returned and reported to Kellerman, "General, a large number of enemy troops were found on the high ground directly ahead, numbering at least 7 or 8,000 people. And they have completed their formation." General Kellerman's heart tightened. He was still in marching formation. To fight against the Prussians, who were close in number, and complete the formation was almost the same as risking death. He still remembered the scene when his army was attacked head-on by Frederick in Westphalia more than 10 years ago. This is probably the main force of the Prussian army in Liegnitz. He made a judgment and immediately ordered one regiment to be left to defend on the spot, while the others retreated in an orderly manner. At the same time, he sent someone to notify Wurmtz to come for reinforcement. However, what he did not expect was that the Austrian forward troops encountered greater trouble than he did, and were already in a bitter battle. Wurmtz also sent cavalry and asked the French to support him immediately. Note 1. Low Countries. The Low Countries are the name given to the countries along the northwest coast of Europe. They got their name because the altitude here is very low, including the Netherlands, Belgium, called Southern Netherlands in the 18th century, and Luxembourg, Chapter 317 France will be the key to the war. You want me to support? French Commander Kellerman pointed to the place where the gunfire was faintly heard on the west side and shouted to the officer who came for help. There are more than 7,000 enemies there, and this is the total number of Prussian troops in the entire Liegnitz. But, General, the dusty messenger glanced in that direction in surprise and hurriedly explained. General Worms was hit by heavy artillery fire, and more than 20,000 Prussian troops suddenly appeared on the south side of the fortress. Sorry, I was also attacked here. Please report to General Worms. I really can't do anything. The messenger said anxiously. Please at least send cavalry to support. Kellerman said decisively, if there is no cavalry to cover my flank, my people will be cut into pieces by the Prussian cavalry before retreating to Kregnitz. Eckert, send someone to send this captain back 69 book bar 69. Caris, order Felix's regiment to set up a second line of defense at the edge of the forest over there, and let Dort's men withdraw in half an hour. Yes, General. On the gentle slope on the south side of the Liegnitz fortress 8 kilometers away, nearly 60 cannons were spewing flames at the Austrians who approached rashly from the positions that had been set up long ago. General Worms never thought that his surprise attack would be counterattacked by the Prussians under the intensive shooting of a large number of artillery. His front team was almost immediately dispersed. Just as he was hesitating whether to deploy the army on the spot and have a head-on confrontation with the Prussians in front, a large number of Prussian troops emerged from the low-lying areas in the southwest and rushed towards him in neat lines. The defenseless Austrians were thrown into a panic. Fortunately, the Prussians deployed their troops inside the depression to increase concealment, giving Worms a temporary advantage in terrain. Worms was also a veteran who had experienced the 7 Years' War and the battle for the Bavarian throne. He immediately seized this only opportunity and ordered his elite skirmishers to launch a counterattack on the Prussian infantry line from a high position. At the same time, he asked Neuendorf's cavalry to go around to the north, showing a posture of attacking the Prussian artillery positions at all costs. General Driesen, commander of the Prussian Liegnitz front, soon received a report from the scouts. As many as 10 Austrian cavalry squadrons, or 1,500 cavalry, were maneuvering towards the rear of the gentle slope where the Prussian artillery was located. The terrain there is higher, almost flush with the artillery positions. If the cavalry launched a charge from there, the Prussian artillery would be in danger. He frowned and weighed the pros and cons. The order given to him by Prince Heinrich was to defend Liegnitz to the death, not to annihilate the Austrian army. He knew very well that he was only facing the Austrian vanguard troops at the moment, and there might be more than 100,000 Austrian troops behind him. If he lost the cannon, it would be impossible to defend Liegnitz with his 30,000 men. After a moment, General Driesen said to the messenger, order Jonas's cavalry to withdraw and do their best to intercept the enemy cavalry. Yes, General. As the orders from both sides came out, on the undulating hills of Liegnitz, a thin green line passed through the bushes and continued to rush northwest, getting farther and farther away from the main Austrian army, like a group of assassins who risked their lives to rush to the heart of the enemy. And another light blue thin line came out from the southeast of the Austrians, avoiding the main Austrian army, and desperately rushed back to the high ground next to the Liegnitz fortress. If Worms looked down from the air at this time, he would definitely be scared and sweating. If the Prussian cavalry had suddenly rushed out during his retreat, his main force would have been cut into immediately, and basically none of them would have been able to return to Bohemia. On the other side, the elite Austrian skirmishers began to scatter under the cover of wild grass and rushed towards the Prussian infantry line below the depression. They were very experienced. Although they were in a skirmish formation, they could use the drummers' drum beats to stand up from different positions to fire volleys, greatly increasing the killing efficiency. Many of them were hunters from the Austrian mountains, and their marksmanship was very good. Taking advantage of the range brought by the high terrain, they dug a lot of gaps in the latter's line formation before the Prussian infantry fought back. However, in the era of flintlock rifles, it was undoubtedly unwise to charge the infantry line with a disadvantageous number of people. Soon, the Prussian infantry line advanced within the range, and with several volleys, the dense rain of bullets covered the hiding places of the Austrian skirmishers' screams. continued to be heard from the weeds on the gentle slope, and then corpses rolled down to the depression one by one, leaving blurred bloodstains on the green grass. Less than 2 regiments of Austrian scattered soldiers fought and retreated, forcing the Prussian infantry line to stop and assemble and shoot. On this gentle slope less than 1 kilometer long, they held up nearly 10,000 Prussian troops for more than an hour. In addition to the gap pulled out by Neuendorf's cavalry, Worms finally withdrew the main force out of the range, covered by the Prussian artillery, and then began to retreat in an orderly manner. Near dusk, Worms finally met Kellermann's French army about 10 kilometers away. From Kregnitz, which is the Austrian border, it was not until he entered the camp built by the French that Worms felt relieved and hurriedly ordered his staff to count the casualties. A few hours later, a simple battle report was submitted to him. The report indicated that approximately 16,000 Austrian soldiers and 9,000 French troops successfully withdrew. As for the Bavarian army on the west side, since there was no fighting, all the 5,000 Austrian troops returned safely. The main force was still there, and Wumuzi breathed a sigh of relief secretly. However, in this battle, his 2 most elite skirmishers were almost wiped out. The cavalry also lost nearly 4 squadrons, and even General Neuendorf was wounded. Therefore, although the number of Austrian troops lost was not too many, the impact on their combat effectiveness was quite serious. At noon the next day, when the Austrian army commander-in-chief Marshal Lacy led the main force to the border of Liegnitz, he encountered the withdrawn Worms army head-on. When he learned about the tragic defeat of the Austrian army yesterday, his face suddenly turned livid. According to his original plan, Liegnitz could be taken by surprise tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, and then the troops would be directed towards Breslau, the capital of Silesia. However, judging from the battle situation Wumuzi encountered, the Prussians were obviously well prepared. I am afraid that what I'm facing will be a fierce battle. When news of Liegnitz's defeat reached Vienna, the whole city was in uproar. Countless Austrians were instantly reminded of the painful memories of the 3 disastrous defeats in the Silesian War in the past few decades. This series of defeats caused Austria to lose the entire fertile Silesia region, and has since fallen into a struggle with Prussia for Germany. Coupled with the negative effects of the previous reforms of Joseph II, the nobles and citizens of Vienna took to the streets, and large-scale protests broke out. 4 to 5,000 people flocked to Schönbrunn Palace, shouting slogans all the way. The frontline commander Count Lacy must be held accountable. Send more troops to Silesia. We must not experience another defeat. Replace the incompetent Lacy and let Marshal Laudon command the army. Yes, only Marshal Laudon can defeat the Prussians. At the same time, the protesters also included a large number of voices dissatisfied with the royal family. They blamed Joseph II's reforms for this fiasco, believing that the reforms affected the morale of the army, and criticized the emperor for rashly entering the army without adequate preparation, waging war against Prussia. Schönbrunn Palace. Although the protesters were kept out of the palace square by guards, Joseph II could still faintly hear the noise coming from the window. After a fit of coughing, Emperor Shin looked at Leopold II and Minister of State Kaunitz, who were standing beside his bed. There is no need to disperse the protesters. Didn't you hear everyone talking about sending more troops to Silesia? This may be an opportunity for Austrians to unite. Kaunitz asked tentatively. Your Majesty, do you think you should give some reminder to Marshal Lacy? What he calls a reminder is really a rebuke. As an Irishman born in Petersburg, Lacy was very politically inclined to Russia. The pro-French Kaunitz often had conflicts with him. Joseph II waved his hand. Please draft an order for me to commend Marshal Lacy. He avoided greater losses to our army with his rich experience. In addition, he severely reprimanded General Wumuzi for his improper command, which led to the collapse of the army. The defeat of Nitz. Although he was seriously ill, he was still clear-headed, and knew that he must fully support the commander-in-chief of the army at this time. Otherwise the morale of the army would be unstable and this battle would not have to be fought. Leopold II said aside. Your Majesty, it seems that the Prussians should be on guard now. Maybe we can appease the Hungarians. At least 50,000 to 60,000 troops can be recruited there. Hungary was quite independent under Austrian rule, especially the Hungarian aristocratic group, which often formed groups to oppose Vienna. Affected by the reforms of Joseph II this time, the rights of the Hungarian nobility were greatly affected. In other words, Joseph II was aiming to weaken them. Therefore, Hungary adopted a passive and confrontational attitude towards the war in Silesia, and sent almost no troops to participate. However, if you want to bring out the full strength of Austria, you must not lack Hungary. Joseph II waved his hand weakly again. In addition to cancelling the reforms, nothing can satisfy them. Send Baron Turgot to Paris, to let our sister increase her troops in exchange for Italian interests. Before he could finish his words, the crowd of protesters outside the square suddenly burst into loud shouts, as if cold water had been poured into boiling oil. Joseph II frowned and looked at Cornets. What happened? The latter bowed, walked out of the emperor's bedroom quickly, and returned with a gloomy face more than 10 minutes later, bowing his head and saying, "Your Majesty, the news just came back from the southern Netherlands. Blücher led his army to invade Luxembourg. General Leo was outnumbered and suffered a disastrous defeat 3 days ago. Now the western part of Luxembourg is under the control of the Prussians." When Joseph II heard this, he coughed violently, then suddenly tilted his body and fell on the bed. Leopold II was frightened and hurriedly shouted to the imperial physician waiting at the door, "Mr. Richter, His Majesty has fainted." After the imperial doctors performed bloodletting on Emperor Shinra 3 times in a row, and took medicine containing Ya tablets, the pale Joseph II finally woke up at dusk. Joseph II was too weak to sit up. After gathering strength for half a minute, he said to Leopold II in a trembling voice, "Order Marshal Laudon to lead 20,000 soldiers and rush to Luxembourg immediately for reinforcement." The latter was shocked and said hurriedly, "Your Majesty, if we divide the troops at this time, Silesia may be short of troops." Joseph II panted and said with difficulty, "Marshal Lacy will find a way. The southern Netherlands must be preserved. Austria has been operating in the southern Netherlands for decades, and the chances of winning there are much greater than attacking Silesia." And Joseph II also knew that, if the southern Netherlands was completely lost, it would seriously affect the morale of the Silesia side. He rested for a while, and then continued, "Also, ask France for help. Let them assist Marshal Laudon." The Emperor of the Empire worked diligently all his life, and worked hard to strengthen Austria's national strength. This time he was full of confidence to retake Silesia, but he didn't expect that the Prussians would risk leaving heavy troops in the southern Netherlands, giving Austria a heavy blow. Seeing that his brother was so weak that he almost fainted again, Leopold II hurriedly patted his chest and left. He left the emperor's bedroom and heard the protester shouts again. He frowned and signaled to the captain of the guard, "Go and disperse those people. His Majesty needs to rest." "Yes, Your Majesty." Austrian Foreign Minister Baron Thugut took the letter signed by Joseph II and rushed to Paris for help day and night, but met the French Crown Prince in Lorraine. The latter was here to review the French army that was about to go to Austria. Of course, Joseph was waiting for the Austrian envoy here. Blücher was about to capture all of Luxembourg, and then Austria would have no foothold in the lowlands, and their emperor would have no choice but to seek help from France. In the French expeditionary force camp, Joseph looked at the anxious Baron Thugut. "You mean, His Majesty the Emperor wants to mobilize the Silesia front to rush to Luxembourg for rescue?" "Yes, Your Highness." The Austrian foreign minister took out the letter from the Holy Roman Emperor. Although it was written to Queen Mary, it was no problem to give it to the French Crown Prince. "Your Majesty hopes that France can send more troops to Luxembourg and provide logistical supplies nearby." Joseph took the letter, but frowned and shook his head. "If we mobilize troops from Silesia now, Luxembourg may be occupied by the Prussians before it reaches the southern Netherlands, and it will fall into a situation where both the southern Netherlands and Silesia are facing a weak situation." Thugut sighed. Although he knew that the situation was mostly like this, General Leo of Luxembourg had less than 2,000 troops left, and he definitely couldn't hold on for more than half a month. Joseph's face was full of concern and sincerity. "There is probably only one way to keep Luxembourg now." Thugut immediately raised his head. "What do you mean?" "The 20,000 troops that our country is going to send to Silesia are just in Verdun. Joseph said, if we set off immediately, we can reach Luxembourg in 3 or 4 days to resist Blucher's offensive, and Austria does not need to transfer troops from Silesia. This way, the weaknesses of the southern Netherlands and Silesia can be turned into advantages. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 318 Arrogant Woman. Baron Turgot immediately said in disbelief, Your Highness, pardon me, you are not kidding, are you? Joseph held his arms tightly. Turgot was not tall, and Joseph, who was 1.7 meters tall, was only a little shorter than him, and said seriously, I believe that Her Majesty the Queen will definitely agree with my proposal. France and Austria are the closest friends, and naturally they must do their best to help each other through the difficulties. The eyes of the Austrian foreign minister lit up, and he nodded excitedly. Yes, you are absolutely right. France and Austria will always be the most steadfast allies. In this case, I will rush to the Palace of Versailles overnight and ask His Majesty to send troops to Luxembourg. Seeing that he was about to get up, Joseph stopped him. We must stop Blucher's offensive as soon as possible to prevent Luxembourg from falling. And it will take too long for you to go to Paris and return. What do you mean? Joseph was in deep thought. How about this? You return to Vienna immediately and ask His Majesty the Emperor to issue an imperial decree to let the Austrian army and officials in Luxembourg fully cooperate with me to snipe the Prussians, and at the same time, call back the troops planned to reinforce the southern Netherlands, and continue to attack Silesia with all your strength. As for the Palace of Versailles, you can send an assistant to submit the letter of credence to Her Majesty the Queen. Baron Turgot wanted to nod, but hesitated and said, wouldn't it be too rude to send only an assistant to meet His Majesty? State affairs are more important. Joseph said righteously, please rest assured, His Majesty will definitely understand you. In addition, I can send someone to accompany your assistant to Paris to explain to His Majesty on your behalf. Thank you so much. Turgot immediately bowed deeply to Joseph. Austria will always remember your kindness. Vienna Point Schönbrunn. Palace. Joseph II put down Turgot's secret letter. His foreign minister had just arrived in Bavaria, and the letter was sent back by a rider who had galloped for 3 days, and finally a faint smile appeared on his bloodless face, and he said to Leopold II, our sister agreed to go and snipe Blucher. In this way, we can continue to maintain the superior force in the direction of Silesia. Oh, tell General Leo to let him accept the command of the French army. Yes, Your Majesty. Leopold II nodded, but said in a deep voice, Your Majesty, will it cause any trouble if a large number of French troops enter the lowlands? The Walloon region of the southern Netherlands basically speaks French, and is very close to France. Austria has always been wary of France's involvement there. Joseph II sighed weakly. General Wurmser failed to make good arrangements for Luxembourg and hurried to Silesia, allowing the Prussians to take advantage of the loophole. Now, apart from relying on the French army, what else can we do? Should we give up the Silesia battlefield? Hearing this, Leopold II lowered his head. Austria has experienced 3 defeats in the Silesian War, and people will never accept a 4th one. At this time, my brother has seriously offended the aristocracy by vigorously promoting reforms. If the front line fails again, there will be a big mess in the country. Don't worry. Joseph II waved his hand. The Prussian army in the southern Netherlands, plus the rebels, has a total of more than 30,000 people. It is already very difficult for 20,000 French troops to defend Luxembourg, and it is unlikely to enter the southern Netherlands. And as long as we resolve the battle in Silesia as soon as possible, the Prussians will naturally withdraw from the southern Netherlands. Although Leopold II also agreed with his brother's statement, he was still a little unwilling and said, then Luxembourg. Joseph II had exhausted his physical strength and lay down, just treat it as an exchange of interests. Luxembourg is acceptable to the French. After all, as long as we can take over the rich Silesia, everything will be worth it. And without the help of the French, Austria will lose the southern Netherlands and Luxembourg together. It is not too bad to exchange the small Luxembourg for the southern Netherlands, which is more than 10 times larger. Leopold II came out of the emperor's bedroom, thinking all the way about how to recruit more troops to Silesia, and unknowingly returned to his room. As soon as he entered the door, he heard his wife's angry scream, "How can she do this?" She is humiliating me, and also humiliating Austria. Then there was the sound of porcelain falling heavily to the ground. Leopold II frowned and looked up at the guard at the door. The latter immediately lowered his head in panic and only muttered softly, "Your Majesty, she went to your study." Leopold II immediately thought of something, pushed the door open quickly, and went straight to the study. He saw a group of maids and servants standing in the corner in fear, and several antique porcelains originally placed on the table were smashed to the ground and turned into pieces. The entire large table was there was only one letter Marie Antoinette wrote to His Majesty the Emperor, but did not mention the marriage of the French Crown Prince. Because of His Majesty's poor health, he gave it to him to deal with. Then the war broke out, and he had not taken care of it. Unexpectedly, it was accidentally found by Vitolika. Leopold II coughed lightly, stepped forward to put the letter away, and then took his wife's hand and comforted her. "Dear, Clementine is far from the age of childbearing, and it is normal for my sister to have concerns. His Majesty has decided not to mention this matter." "Why? Didn't you mention it? Didn't you and your brother say before that this matter would definitely happen?" Vitolika withdrew his hand forcefully and gritted his teeth. "I have told almost all the ladies and celebrities. Clementine will become the Crown Princess of France and has received congratulations from countless people. Now, you are telling me to give up on this matter?" She pointed at her husband's nose and said viciously, "You loser. How did you become a husband and father? That woman has humiliated us like this, and you don't even think about it. Dare to help us seek justice, Marie Antoinette," she shouted hoarsely. "One day, I will avenge this humiliation tenfold and 100-fold. Leopold II stuffed the letter into his pocket, shook his head and said, "Don't be like this, Vitolika. She is my biological sister. And in fact, the Palace of Versailles did not say anything about the engagement. It was you who spread the news without authorization. Oh, forget it. Forget about this. We will choose a good marriage for Clementine, and His Majesty the Emperor will definitely give her a generous dowry, so that she will live a very happy life in the future." "No, how could I forget? You care about family affection. Why doesn't she care about it?" Vitolika's chest heaved violently, and his eyes were filled with chills. "I want that woman to know that she made a stupid mistake." Leopold II shook his head helplessly, whispered to his servants to take care of his wife, and then turned around and went to the conference hall. There are still a lot of things waiting for him to deal with in Austria. Where can he distract himself from the short-term matters of his family? France, Verdun. Just as the Austrian foreign minister left, Joseph ordered the guards to set off for Luxembourg. He knew that Joseph II had no other choice but to rely on France to deal with Blücher. Chapter 319 Flying Artillery. On the wide and smooth King's Road in France, nearly 20,000 French soldiers lined up in a marching column that could not be seen at a glance, marching quickly and the loud singing 69. In the back of the team, the young Napoleon leaned tightly on a tall artillery carriage pulled by 4 horses, just like cuddling with a lover. Well, the others were sitting on the carriage, but he would rather walk beside the artillery carriage, just to see her from all angles and touch her. That was the latest model of riding artillery carriage produced by Joseph's Jewel Carriage Company. Joseph ordered the craftsman to trial manufacture it more than half a year ago, and it was just completed a few months ago. The first batch of more than 20 vehicles were built, all equipped to the guard's core. This large-sized horse artillery carriage, which looks like a long wooden house, was made based on Napoleon's later horse artillery. Of course, with some necessary improvements. The concept of horse artillery was created by Frederick the Great during the 7 Years' War, the so-called horse artillery. in simple terms, is to equip the cannon and the gunner with enough horses to drag and maneuver throughout the process, so that the movement speed of the cannon is doubled, thereby greatly increasing the flexibility of artillery tactics. However, there were many shortcomings in the early horse artillery, such as the cannon had to be constantly untied and tied with ropes connected to the horses, resulting in too long preparation time. The general view of this era was that it took more than 1/3 longer for the horse artillery to complete the firing than ordinary artillery. In addition, the horse artillery was not suitable for heavy artillery. Usually, it was difficult to drag a cannon of more than 6 pounds with horses to move quickly. A 12-pound cannon required 8 horses to drag, and the soldiers who drove the horses were well trained if they could keep the horses in order, and it was basically impossible to run faster. So at the end of the 18th century, countries were still mainly equipped with ordinary artillery, supplemented by a small number of horse artillery. However, Napoleon, a genius in using artillery, brought the advantages of cavalry artillery to the extreme, and even turned all the artillery of some legions into cavalry artillery. He had many innovations in the application of cavalry artillery. For example, cavalry artillery used speed to rush forward quickly, fired several rounds of volleys at the enemy's face, and then quickly evacuated. Another example is to equip cavalry battalions with cavalry and follow the cavalry to gallop and bomb all the way. In short, after him, the importance of cavalry artillery in various countries has doubled. But for the time being, Emperor Napoleon is still a newbie drooling over the cavalry artillery. In history, Napoleon's cavalry artillery had 2 main core equipment: horse-drawn cannons and ammunition carts. The long wooden house that Napoleon was hugging and licking at this time was the ammunition cart that was very common later, nicknamed shed car. This thing integrated the logistics support of the artillery and could quickly drag out the shells and gunpowder inside during combat, and could be loaded in a short time when moving and dragged away by horses. This is much more convenient and time-saving than the gunpowder cart, ammunition cart, and tool cart used by Frederick's cavalry artillery, which had to be harnessed to horses when moving. And speed is the biggest advantage of cavalry artillery. Joseph combined the structure of later heavy-duty trucks and added a plow to this type of vehicle and changed the shell and gunpowder modules to a pull-out structure. The covers of the gunpowder and shell boxes used automatic locks. This was designed by Louis XVI himself, and it was strong and reliable. With these changes, the cannon's firing preparation was 7 or 8 seconds faster than the original version in history. In addition, Joseph also added 6 seats to the ammunition cart for the gunners to ride. Soldiers were not allowed to ride in the caravan in history, and the gunners had to run with the car on foot. But no one could stand not sitting in a carriage. So the gunners sat on the roof of the ammunition cart, which was shaped like a sloping French roof. Although the buttocks must be uncomfortable, if you want to be lazy, you can only endure it. Joseph knew that it was extremely difficult to prevent the gunners from riding in the car, so he simply added seats for them, which was at most a matter of adding a horse. This also greatly increased the movement speed of the cavalry artillery. As for the cannon, Joseph also made some improvements, mainly adding the kind of clips between the train carriages in later generations to the tail of the gun. Don't underestimate this change. When the cavalry artillery needs to move, the time to put the cannon on the horse can be greatly shortened, and the operation is also easier. Another thing is to add a winch to the gun carriage. When the cannon is fired, the horse needs to stay far away to prevent it from being startled. In this way, every time the cannon is fired and the movement is switched, a lot of time is wasted to put the horse. Therefore, the cavalry artillery in the Napoleonic era invented a unique operation. The rope connecting the cannon to the horse is left very long, and the lasso is not untied when shooting. In this way, when you want to maneuver, you only need to tighten the rope and you can get on the road immediately. Joseph went a step further and even skipped the rope. The horse dragged a long rope and went directly, and then the gunner used the winch on the gun carriage to slowly wheel in the rope. This is the real ability to fight and run. Napoleon stroked the new cavalry artillery vehicle that fascinated him, and recalled the cavalry artillery tactics he had trained in his mind, and his heart was filled with excitement. If these exquisite tactics and sophisticated weapons can be used to equip the Corsican national army, it will increase their combat effectiveness exponentially. He took a deep breath and it seemed that coming to Verdun this time was absolutely the right decision. The troops were about to arrive in Luxembourg, where they would fight the Prussians, and he would be able to gain experience in actual combat and grow into a real general. When central and western Luxembourg Blücher saw more than 100 Austrian defenders in the town fleeing in panic through the telescope, and said to the messenger expressionlessly, "Leave a battalion to garrison, and the others will rest for an hour, and then continue to move south. I want to capture Diekirch before tomorrow afternoon." After defeating Leo's main force, the battle became very easy, which made him a little bored. Just like when attacking Wincel just now, he only ordered a dozen rounds of artillery fire, and the defending Austrians ran away. It can be predicted that the battle to attack Diekirch tomorrow will most likely be the same. And after taking it, there will be no more obstacles on the road to Luxembourg City. Leo's troops should still have about 1,600 people left, and he brought 10 times the troops, so there is no suspense in capturing Luxembourg City. His staff officers suddenly rushed over and handed him a wax-sealed paper roll. "General, Potsdam sent it 4 days ago." Blücher opened the secret order, frowned slightly, and looked up at the staff officer. The French have joined the war. Although General Dreesen defeated them in Liegnitz, this is a very dangerous signal. He shook the reins. "Order to speed up the march. We must solve the problem here as soon as possible, and then return to Silesia to reinforce the Duke." At this moment, 2 hussars galloped over and shouted to him, "General, a large group of enemy troops were found 2 miles to the south. There may be several thousand people." Blücher was startled when he heard this. Could it be the Austrian reinforcement? How could they come so quickly? Chapter 320 Fierce Battle in Luxembourg. The first release of this book provides you with a reading experience with no wrong chapters and no out of order chapters. Are they reinforcement from Vienna? The staff officer on the side asked the question that Blücher was most concerned about. A hussar immediately shook his head and said, "No, sir, the flag should be Leo Legion." Blücher couldn't help but frown slightly. Leo should have less than 2,000 soldiers left in his hands. Where did he suddenly get thousands of people? His staff officer obviously thought about the same problem and said sideways, "General, could it be that he brought out all the defenders in Luxembourg City? That number is wrong." Blücher said half a sentence, but couldn't help but remember something, and hurriedly signaled to the staff to get a map, and asked the hussars to point out the location where the enemy was found. On it when he saw the cavalry in charge of reconnaissance pointing due north of Diekirch, his eyes suddenly froze. No, the Austrians are trying to run away. Leo should have not only mobilized the garrison of Luxembourg City, but also the troops from the surrounding cities. "Run," the staff officer said in surprise. "Why did he?" Blücher showed a sneer. "I guess he wants to bypass us and use all Luxembourg's forces to sneak attack Liège. If he succeeds, we will have to temporarily abandon Luxembourg City and return to the west to chase him." This bought him time for reinforcement from Vienna. "General, shall we intercept him?" "It's not just interception." Blücher, who always liked to rush and fight fiercely, immediately told the messenger, "Cancel the rest and the whole army will assemble immediately." Order Crystal's regiment to continue attacking Diekirch. After taking Diekirch, he will go straight to Luxembourg City. If I'm not wrong, there should be no defenders there. "Yes, General." The herald quickly recorded. Blücher pointed with his finger at a hill on the northeast side of the map. "Have each and all drag the cannon up there and set up a position. If Leo's troops want to go to Liège, they will definitely pass by there. As long as a cannon is set up halfway up the mountain, the Austrians can be hit head on." Blücher continued. The Ottoman army immediately marched eastward and must intercept the Austrians. The cavalry follows the enemy and continues to harass them to slow them down, but no forceful attack is allowed without my order. He raised his riding whip proudly and looked extremely confident. "I will personally lead the main force to give Leo a severe blow from the side. The next step will be a performance of the cavalry chasing and defeating the enemy, regardless of whether Leo plans to escape or to sneak attack Liège." His morale is currently strong and his military strength is absolutely superior, so he can kill them right here. Silesia is where he made his achievements. Luxembourg is not worth his time. It's just that Blücher didn't notice that his deployment stretched the Prussian army into a long line from west to east, with its flanks completely exposed to the south. On the narrow path less than 10 kilometers east of the main Prussian force in Luxembourg, Austrian Commander Leo looked nervously at the middle-aged man beside him. Major Lefebvre, your scouts have just discovered traces of the Prussian hussars. He glanced at the slowly marching team sideways. Normally, the Prussians would catch up quickly. And we have less than 4,000 people here. Lefebvre smiled. If that's the case, you have accomplished a great service, General, but Leo looked behind him and swallowed hard. His Royal Highness the Crown Prince's main force is still in Dixie. Before he arrives, there is no way we can hold on. Yesterday afternoon, he learned that the Prussians were approaching the town of Wenzel. Just when he was frightened, he suddenly heard the news that His Royal Highness the Dauphin of France had personally led an army of 20,000 troops to come for reinforcement. At that time, he almost cried with excitement. He had already received the order from His Majesty the Emperor and knew that the French army would come, but he never expected that it would come so quickly. According to the news sent from Vienna, the French army should have set off from Verdun 2 days ago, and the troops were from there. It usually takes about 5 days to reach the town of Dunkerque. Little did he know that with the terrifying marching speed of the French Royal Guards, the 2-day rush march covered more than 50 kilometers. Then, Leo almost cried again. This time it was scary. The French Dauphin's first order, when he saw him, was for him to immediately lead his troops to maneuver towards Blücher's left flank and set up defenses. Near a low hill there. Blücher brought a total of 17,000 Prussian soldiers and nearly 5,000 Dutch rebels, but he only had about 1,600 men left. What's the difference between this and a lamb running into a pack of wolves? Then the French Dauphin told him that a legion would be sent to cover him. Just as Leo was about to breathe a sigh of relief, he heard the Crown Prince's order to transfer a regiment and a battalion, a total of 2,200 soldiers, to accompany him to die. Less than 4,000 people provoked more than 20,000 Prussian troops. What else but death? After that, he was escorted almost all the way by Lefebvre to the east side of Blücher's army, and then he found Prussian hussars appearing. Lefebvre seemed very confident. Don't worry, His Highness will definitely arrive in time. Before Leo could say anything else, he added, the main force of the Guards Corps was back, hiding in the distant town of Dunkerque to avoid Prussian reconnaissance. According to the plan of the General Staff, the Prussians are now completely unable to realize that there is a French army nearby that is capable of destroying them. When their attention is all on us, thunder will fall on their heads. But, Leo said with a bitter face, Your Highness is still more than a day's journey from here. No, at most half a day. The Altman Infantry Regiment of the Prussian Guards, as well as a skirmish battalion and 5 cavalry squadrons accompanying them, almost ran at full speed to intercept the fleeing Austrians in front. Altman did not bring artillery, and those bulky guys would seriously slow him down. And there was no need for cannons to deal with those vulnerable Austrians. In the previous few months, his legion had fought with the Austrian army several times, winning more and losing less, especially after entering Luxembourg. It was like crushing dry, withered and rotten. You lazy things, hurry up, he shouted at the soldiers beside him. Don't force me to whip you with a horsewhip. In fact, in order to speed up the march, his legion formation has been completely dispersed. In this less than 10 kilometers, the number of soldiers who have fallen behind is nearly 1/10. But in order to intercept Leo's army, this is acceptable. A hussar ran towards him and shouted to Altman, Lieutenant Colonel, the Austrian army is not moving. The latter hurriedly took the map and, under the instructions of the scout, looked at the low mountain 2 kilometers away to the east. It was a hill less than 2 kilometers wide, with dense forests on the north side and an inverted V-shaped open space in front. He immediately snorted disdainfully. These guys found that they couldn't escape and were ready to fight. He signaled the staff to put away the map. Although they picked a good battlefield, it can't stop us. Order. Bishop's regiment is lined up in front, and the skirmisher battalion will attack from the hillside on the south side, trying to disrupt the Austrian formation. The messenger urged his horse to leave, and Altman was instructing the cavalry captain on how to attack the Austrian defense, but suddenly heard the sound of hurried horse hooves. He glanced at the cavalry captain in surprise, and the latter immediately shook his head to indicate that it was not his people. And then there was a scream from the side in front. A signalman rode in and said anxiously from a distance, "Lieutenant Colonel." The Austrian cavalry attacked our front team, and Captain Jonas is commanding the company to resist. Altman and the cavalry captain looked at each other. Both of them were full of disbelief. The Austrians dared to take the initiative to attack. Altman immediately shouted, "Schlosser, chase them immediately. Perhaps this is still an opportunity to break through the Austrian defense line in the chaos." The cavalry captain immediately turned his horse away with a dark face, calling out to his cavalrymen loudly. Hundreds of meters away, more than 300 cavalrymen of the Guards Corps in Austrian uniforms rushed past the Prussians from the side. With the impact of the gallop, the cavalry only needed to hold their sabers horizontally, and the blades easily cut through the bodies of the Prussian infantry. Almost instantly, a border made of blood appeared in front of Altman on the left. Captain Jonas was desperately commanding the soldiers to line up, but the infantry line that had just taken shape was immediately rushed to pieces. The Austrian cavalry drew an arc in the distance, quickly formed a team, and then rushed towards the Prussian army again. At the front of the queue, a young man with curly hair and a little fat had excitement in his eyes. He carefully controlled the speed of the horse, and kept the same speed as his teammates on both sides. His hand had already touched the handle of the saber uncontrollably. Jog, sprint. With the order of the cavalry commander, the curly-haired young man squeezed the horse's belly hard and raised the saber diagonally upward. The sturdy Arabian horse under his crotch panted loudly and rushed towards the Prussians with unstoppable momentum. Yes, although he was only a new recruit who had only joined the Guards for a few months, he was able to control one of the top dozen horses in his cavalry battalion. Unlike the Champagne Corps where he used to be, the Guards Corps only assigned war horses according to personal ability and merit. He was awarded this purebred Arabian horse by the battalion commander personally for his almost perfect scores in daily assessments and his amazing performance of slashing 3 targets with a sword when crossing an obstacle point. Although he was only the son of a minor official, he had an amazing affinity for horses. After only being a cavalryman for more than 2 years, he mastered extremely proficient riding skills. The sound of horse hooves beat his nerves rhythmically like a war drum, and everything around him seemed to slow down, giving him a wonderful feeling of being able to control everything. There were still 50 steps to the trembling infantry holding flintlocks in front. 40 steps. 10 steps. The curly-haired young man noticed the gap of more than 3 meters between several infantrymen with his sharp eyes. He immediately pulled the reins lightly, lowered his head, and stabbed into the gap. At the same time, he swung his saber and cut off half of the chest of the Prussian on the right side diagonally. Warm blood splashed on the hind legs of his warhorse, and more sprayed all over the body and face of the Prussian infantryman next to him. Those infantrymen were shocked by the smell of blood and their eyes widened. They tried their best to wipe the sticky blood off their faces and suddenly became a mess behind the curly-haired cavalry. Other Guards cavalrymen immediately discovered the gap and rushed over as the knife flashed. The gap in the Prussian queue became larger and larger, and 50 or 60 infantrymen were cut off from the defense line. Immediately, the Guards cavalry circled around the isolated soldiers several times and then fled away again. As a whole team, there were no Prussians standing there. Just these 2 simple attacks caused the Altman Legion to lose nearly a company of infantry. Officers, soldiers, and orderlies were mixed together, and it was obvious that they could not form an effective defensive formation for a while. The cavalry commander of the Guards Corps urged his horse to catch up with the curly-haired young man who was running at the front. He raised his hand and patted him on the shoulder. He said with a smile on his face, "Well done, Murat. If you can have such a beautiful breakthrough into the enemy camp again, I will go back and help you apply for a medal." Murat also grinned, "You can just apply for a medal for me." "Oh, I want a silver medal of fleur-de-lis, not a copper one. Because in this battle, I was able to kill at least 10 Prussians. Maybe 20, who knows." The was good-natured laughter from the side. Everyone was all too familiar with the bragging ability of this young man from Guyenne, such as how he fought with 5 soldiers in the Champagne Legion and won, or being pursued by 6 girls at the same time, and finally marrying none of them in order not to make them sad. The cavalry commander smiled and patted his shoulder again. I know you're not bragging, like that time you chopped down 3 targets. Oh, remember to save your horsepower, otherwise your horse may not be able to accompany you to complete 10 kills. Don't worry, it's very strong. It's almost as strong as mine. There was another burst of laughter all around as the cavalry of the Guards Corps quickly formed their team again and rushed towards the Prussians. A group of cavalry in light blue military uniforms rushed from behind them. The Guards Corps did not bother, turned their horses' heads and left quickly. They had already spent too much energy just now, and it was not appropriate to engage in a head-on fight at this time. And their mission is to stall for time. After all their struggles, it took the Altman Legion a full hour and a half to regain order and begin to march towards Leo's position. When Altman saw the Austrian infantry lines in the telescope, he gritted his teeth and roared, "Let Bischoff launch a strong attack immediately. Schlosser, be careful on both wings of the infantry. The Austrian cavalry is somewhat capable." Just as Major Bischoff ordered his soldiers to form an infantry line and was about to launch an attack, he suddenly heard the sound of a horn from the Austrian army on the opposite side, and then the crooked infantry line started to move. Head straight towards them. Bischoff's eyelids twitched. Are the Austrians crazy? How dare they launch an active attack with such a small number of people? Exclamation mark. Chapter 321 French-speaking Austrian army. As a Junker noble who participated in the battle for the Bavarian throne, Bischoff had relatively solid military qualities. Although he was very disdainful of the stupid offensive move of the Austrians, he still carefully inspected his own infantry lines personally, and then ordered the skirmishers to attack first to disrupt the enemy's formation, and the infantry lines followed suit. The distance between the infantry lines of both sides soon shortened to more than 300 steps. Bischoff saw that the Austrian queue was becoming more and more messy. The movement speed on the south side was obviously much slower than that on the north side, and there was also a slower moving section in the middle. The whole area looks like a broken line. As expected, the elite of Leo's army had been wiped out. He put down his telescope and ordered the herald on the side, order the second column to also press forward and try to completely defeat the Austrians before Lieutenant Colonel Altman sends cavalry to outflank them. Defeat? Yes, Mr. Captain. Soon, the infantry line Bischoff left behind also moved and rushed towards the enemy with the sound of drums at the same time. The Prussian skirmisher company at the front of the battlefield also exchanged fire with the Austrian soldiers. Nearly 100 skirmishers relied on the cover of rubble piles on the north side of the battle line to get close to the Austrian infantry line. They fired a few shots at will, which actually made the already messy line formation even more chaotic. Leo had to order to stop advancing and start to form the team on the spot. At this time, the Prussian infantry line arrived less than 100 steps away from them. Bischoff happily looked at the battlefield situation as if he were making military exploits. He raised his hand and waved at the enemy with 2 fingers and said to the herald, "Attack on all fronts." Before he finished speaking, several columns of soldiers suddenly rushed out from among the chaotic Austrian infantry lines in the distance. He frowned and raised his binoculars again and saw that the columns were very neatly arranged and advancing extremely fast. The northernmost column immediately changed formation after receiving a round of fire from his skirmisher company. Those Austrians were highly trained. It took less than half a minute for the column of 70 or 80 people to transform into a simple line formation. Then under the command of the officer, they moved towards the scattered rocks. The soldiers fired a concentrated volley. Bischoff felt that there was something wrong with the gunfire and did not react for a while. All he saw was that his company of skirmishers seemed to have been blindsided by a punch. They were stunned in place and forgot to even fight back. These rubbish. He was far away and could not clearly feel the terrifying team-changing speed and shooting accuracy of the Austrians, but the Prussian skirmishers on the front line could see clearly from a distance of less than 40 steps. The feeling of oppression simply made their spines tingle. The skirmisher company commander was the first to react, shouting orders to spread out to both sides and counterattack. On the short infantry line on the opposite side, the Austrians began to load ammunition quickly. Although a few people were shot by Prussian skirmishers, others seemed not to see it, and their hands were not slow at all. In just 16 or 17 seconds, the sounds of preparation and aiming came from the infantry line. This was followed by a thunderous volley of more than 70 guns. 8 Prussians were overturned by lead bullets, and the bodies of 2 of them rolled down the gentle slope. You know, this is the era of muskets, and such a high hit rate is simply terrifying. When the Austrian infantry line advanced more than 10 steps under the leadership of the flag bearer, the skirmishers scattered among the rocks began to retreat in fear. The company commander of the skirmisher company tried his best to restrain his men, but he could only stop a dozen people around him, so he had no choice but to order the entire company to move to the outside of the infantry line. This is why skirmishers require a higher degree of training. Since there is no cue, soldiers have a very high degree of autonomy. Regardless of whether there is a tailwind or a headwind, it is easy for soldiers to disobey orders and walk alone. The skirmisher company commander didn't suddenly realize until he retreated beyond the enemy's range. The officer on the opposite side seemed to be commanding in French. On the battlefield, other soldiers of Bishop's regiment soon experienced similar fear. Those Austrian soldiers speaking French advanced so fast that the Prussian infantry lines only had time to fire 2 rounds of volleys. Those columns had already reached 60 steps away from them, and then the 2 middle columns crossed over, while the other 4 columns spread out on their flanks. After the Prussians fired their 4th volley, a straight line of infantry appeared in front of them. Then came a high-pitched cry in French. Aim. Shooting. There was a dense explosion, accompanied by a large fire, but it was not like the smoke that filled the sky like ordinary flintlock shooting. Only the faint black smoke ejected from the muzzle rose, and then blood spattered in the Prussian infantry line. Dozens of people were killed by this volley. Blood plasma and residual limbs fell on the bodies and feet of the Prussian soldiers, making everyone tremble in their hearts. But the officers' shouts and curses immediately penetrated their ears. Everyone move. Reload. Just move if you don't want to be killed. Come on, you idiots. The soldiers suddenly became excited. Although their minds went blank, their hands reflexively began to put their flintlock guns on the ground and took out the powder packets. The Prussian infantry's firing speed is well known in Europe. In the era of Frederick the Great, it was said that it could lead the infantry of other countries by 1 bullet per minute. After William II ascended the throne, although the military training was relaxed, the pursuit of firing speed became more abnormal. There was even a case of not loading bullets in order to increase the firing speed. However, this time, the Prussian soldiers were generally still pouring the propellant when they heard French from the opposite side. Ready, aim. The Prussians were numb. This is too fast. Both sides just finished the volley and started loading almost at the same time. I still have 2 steps to complete here, and the other side is about to open fire. Fire. With the loud command of the officer on the opposite side, a rain of lead bullets accompanied by the background sound of thunder rushed towards the Prussian infantry line, and suddenly there was another wailing and screaming on the 2-kilometer-long front. The Prussian soldier who had just finished reloading was interrupted in an instant. It took him another 10 seconds to raise his gun under the urging of the officer. The other side was almost done with the next reload. After several rounds of shooting, the Prussians' confidence began to collapse. Their shooting speed, which they were always proud of, was actually firmly suppressed by the Austrians. How could they not lose their confidence? Of course, they didn't know that the percussion cap guns used by the Austrians on the opposite side had 3 fewer steps when reloading than their flintlock guns, and the amount of training was several times more than theirs. Chapter 320 to the Guide to the Netherlands. With advanced weapons, extremely high training, and high morale support, the Guards Corps pretending to be Austrians will definitely gain a very significant advantage over the Prussian soldiers when it comes to shooting! 69 book bar 69. In this way, Bishop, who was holding a telescope on the high ground behind, watched more than 800 Austrians smash his infantry line. Of nearly 1,000 people, the opponent still rushed up in column. During this period, his side took the lead in firing 2 rounds, but he still could not withstand the rapid and intensive firepower. Soon, Bishop's face became even more ugly. Because he was too confident before, he pressed the 2nd infantry line too high. At this time, the first group retreated and plunged into the rear line. causing chaos in the rear line. It is impossible for the line infantry tactics of this era to stud all the soldiers into an infantry line. Instead, it is divided into several fronts, usually 3 fronts, with 3 rows of soldiers in each infantry line. This is the most stable combat mode nowadays. In an advantageous situation or a life-threatening situation, it may be reduced to 2 fronts, front and back, in order to put more soldiers in each front. This arrangement is so that if an accident occurs to the front infantry line, the following line can immediately push forward, and the defeated infantry can regroup behind them. This would prevent a single breakdown in the infantry line, sometimes caused by an officer falling out of love or drinking too much the day before, to cause the entire battle to collapse. Lieutenant Colonel Altman, who was watching the battle from a distance, saw that Bishop's regiment was unable to withstand the situation and hurriedly ordered the reserve team to go up to respond. He was secretly glad that the reserve team was still left and sent someone to ask the cavalry for help. Lefebvre also saw in his telescope the scene of the Guards Corps' brave assault and defeating the Prussian infantry line that outnumbered him, and he smiled at the corner of his mouth. But he immediately looked at the Leo Legion behind him and shook his head secretly. Even though our side had gained a huge advantage more than 100 steps away, the Austrians, who were frightened by Blücher, still shrank their heads and did not appear to step forward to expand the results. Just after the Guards Corps began to fire 2 or 3 volleys at the second line of Prussian infantry, Lefebvre saw another Prussian infantry coming from behind for reinforcement. After some weighing, he ordered the forward guard infantry to be called back. He couldn't tell whether the Prussians had any reserves. If so, he was too deep into the army at a disadvantage and might be surrounded by the opponent's cavalry tactics. His own cavalry had been exhausted by the previous rapid attack. With a lot of physical strength, it is very likely that he will not be able to catch up with the enemy cavalry. The order given to him by His Royal Highness the Crown Prince is to hold on here until noon tomorrow. Before that, he must not lose too many troops. Moreover, the main force of the Prussians may appear at any time. It will be an extremely difficult and fierce battle, and he must be prepared at any time. When Altman saw that the Austrians did not pursue the victory, he was relieved. He quickly ordered Bishop to retreat, gathered his soldiers and set up defenses, and only stared at the enemy on the opposite slope from a distance. In this way, dusk fell more than an hour later, and both sides gathered up and camped. Blücher received the news from the front that Altman's attack was unfavorable, and couldn't help but wonder, why did Leo suddenly become so good at fighting? It must have been Altman's command error. He came to a conclusion in his mind and was about to go back and scold the lieutenant colonel civilly, then frowned and looked at the sky, but he had to temporarily suppress his anger and wait for dawn. At the same time, the main force of the Guards Corps, which was 10 kilometers away, was still moving forward quickly under the last ray of sunset. Since they have been outside the reconnaissance range of the Prussian hussars, Blücher has not yet discovered this army of more than 10,000 people. But Joseph knew that if he continued to move forward, he might encounter the Prussians at any time. It wasn't until it was completely dark that the guards camped near a flat woodland. Joseph and the staff officers lit up lamps and discussed the battle plan in the tent until late at night, because there was new intelligence ahead. After sending it back, tactics must be adjusted accordingly. This is one of the advantages of the staff command system. Even if the top commander wants to be lazy, the staff will drag him to work overtime. Your Highness, since Lefebvre has gained the advantage, Berthier suggested, looking at the narrow Prussian marching column on the map, we can definitely fight more aggressively. He pointed to the east side of the town of Wenzel. You can send a group of cavalry to attack the enemy's rear, and the rest of the troops will insert themselves into the waist of the Prussian army. Although the losses of Lefebvre's army may be relatively large, I believe that he will be able to block Blücher's path to the west. We can complete the pincer attack on the main force of Prussia with him. Joseph pressed the hand that pointed at the map and said with a smile, Your Majesty General, we don't have to rush to annihilate the Prussian army. Even when Blücher made a mistake, we had to take the initiative to let him go. Actually, I have sent people to get in touch with Henry Ank, who is here to release water. Henry Ank is the conservative leader of the Southern Netherlands rebellion. He is currently being squeezed out by the liberal Van de Noort because of his different opinions on the future path of the Southern Netherlands. He has almost fallen out of power. Point Berthier didn't dwell on the word let go. His Royal Highness often used strange words, and he was used to it. Looked at Joseph in surprise and asked, "Your Highness, why did you let the Prussians go? Are you worried about the political impact?" Joseph put on a mysterious expression and deliberately lowered his voice. "If Blücher's corps is gone, we will have no reason to enter the Southern Netherlands. He is our guide." Joseph ignored the doubts on the Chief of Staff's face, turned around and greeted the staff. "Our primary goal is to recapture Luxembourg, and the losses of Lefebvre's corps must be kept to a minimum. Based on this direction, let's discuss the details of the combat deployment." "Yes, Your Highness." The next morning, Blücher personally rode his horse through the camp, urging the soldiers to move out as soon as possible. He was now very worried that Bischoff would not be able to stop Leo after his defeat. After nearly an hour, the Prussian army finally packed up the tents, drove the carriages to the road, and lined them up neatly, and then began to move slowly with the sound of drums. Blücher looked at the sun that had not yet risen completely, and was quite satisfied with the speed. If nothing unexpected happened, the main force would be able to start attacking Leo around 3 o'clock this afternoon. What he didn't know was that Joseph had led the Guards Corps to set out for more than 40 minutes at this time. The Guards Corps, which had no tents and camped in the open air, began to march almost as soon as it was light enough to see things, and the baggage vehicles were less than half of the Prussians. Chapter 323 The Strong Resilience of the Southern Netherlands Rebels. At 10:30 in the morning, the Prussian Southern Netherlands commander Margrave Blücher received news from the forward that they had merged with the Altman army and saw the Austrian defense line. Blücher was secretly happy. As long as Leo's Austrian army did not escape, his battle in Luxembourg would basically be over. Just as he was about to order a full-scale attack on the Austrians, he saw several hussars running like crazy. From a distance, he shouted loudly, "Report. General, there are a large number of enemy troops more than half a mile to the south. The number is unknown, but there are at least 7 or 8,000 people." Blücher suddenly frowned. Where did this enemy appear from? He dispersed the scouts 2 miles away, almost to the vicinity of Dickish town, and never received any reports of signs of other troops. Even the Austrian army defending Diekirch couldn't have walked so far in a long time, and suddenly hit him in the face! 2 miles is almost equivalent to 15 kilometers away. With such a large reconnaissance range, he has been cautious enough, but he did not expect that he was facing a Guards Corps that was marching at an abnormal speed. Another hussar then said, "General, judging from their uniforms, those should be French." Blücher felt confused for a while. "French? How can this be?" "Due to caching reasons, please visit the 69book69 website directly with your browser to watch the fastest chapter updates." He had just received a report from the intelligence department a few days ago, saying that the troops assembled by the French in Verdun were bound for Silesia. How come they were transferred to Luxembourg without warning? He violently broke the riding crop in his hand, and said fiercely in his heart, "These fools from the intelligence department must report them in front of His Majesty the King." After they returned to Potsdam, however, the damn French were very close at this time, and something had to be done. After Blücher asked the scouts to mark the location where the French army was found. Blücher couldn't help but look a little ugly. In order to prevent Leo from escaping, he ordered the army to rush towards the Austrians at full speed, causing the soldiers to form a narrow east-west line formation. The location where the French army appeared was exactly in the middle of this long line. If he continues to attack Leo's Austrian army, his waist will inevitably be hit hard by the French. Although one's own troops are superior, if the front and rear armies are cut off, they can easily be annihilated separately. The staff officer on the side whispered, "General, we should temporarily put down the Austrians." Blücher glared at him and gritted his teeth. "We must not let Leo run away. Austria has been operating in Luxembourg for decades and has a very deep influence. If Leo and he go around in circles in the Luxembourg Liège area, then his time to go to Silesia to join the war will be delayed again and again." He glanced at the position of his own troops on the map, and suddenly his eyes lit up. "God bless, the Dutch army is right in front of the French at this time." He looked at the staff officer. They are a tough nut to crack. Send an order for the back horse regiment to cooperate with Altman to attack the Austrian army. The battle must be over before 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Yes, General. The herald immediately took notes. Quickly point Blücher used the heel of his riding crop to point at a mountain pass area on the map. Let the Dutch army set up defenses here and stop the French at all costs. He pointed to the end of the current team. Dietland's army immediately turned south. The Dutch only need to hold on until 3 o'clock in the afternoon at most, and they will be able to reach the French left flank from the west, according to the previous performance of the Dutch rebel army in his battle with the Austrian Wilmser army. These fanatical liberals are extremely resilient, especially the priests among them, who can survive with a broken hand. Continue to fight in the online formation for more than 10 minutes. At that time, less than 10,000 Dutch troops stood firmly in front of the main Austrian force and held out for nearly 5 hours until the Duke of Brunswick completed the deployment of troops and formed an encirclement against the Austrians. They did not collapse. Although the Dutch army currently only has 5,000 men, relying on the narrow terrain, it should be very possible to hold back 7 to 8,000 French troops for more than 4 hours. Moreover, he will leave some cavalry and artillery to support them, making it easier than the last battle. This is still the most conservative estimate. If Altman can quickly defeat the Austrians, they can also encircle the French army from the east. The staff officer on the side suggested, General, should we send cavalry to harass the French to slow down their advance? Blücher nodded. Ask Hill to lead 6 cavalry squadrons to conduct raids. At present, the quality of the Prussian army is far inferior to that of the era of Frederick the Great. The combat effectiveness of the cavalry, which is almost entirely composed of junker nobles, can still be seen. In many cases, they can influence the situation of the Prussian army. Blücher then deployed the artillery and the main dragoons, and the herald quickly conveyed his orders to each unit. The Prussian army, which had originally formed a long and narrow marching column, responded immediately. The 5,000 Dutch rebels in the middle of the queue formed a formation near the mountain pass to block the French army. The back horse army at the front continued to advance, annihilating the Austrians as quickly as possible. Halder's army, which was originally in the rear, turned 90 degrees and attacked the French left flank. At the same time, Blücher placed all artillery on the hillsides on both sides of the Dutch army to prevent the French army from quickly breaking through the defense line. There were also 10 dragoon squadrons, about 1,500 people, ready to maneuver on the right wing of the French army at any time, waiting for the opportunity to enter the battlefield. It can be said that his deployment was almost textbook-like and impeccable when his side had an advantage in manpower. However, in the Prussian military textbooks, there was no such unit as the French Royal Guard. Then his knowledge and experience would probably become a big pit. At nearly 12 noon, the main force of the French Royal Guard had arrived less than 2 kilometers outside the mountain pass where Blücher deployed defenses. It is called a mountain pass here, but it is actually quite wide. There is a flat area of about 3 kilometers between the low mountains on both sides. However, as long as the middle section is pinched, the two sides will be impassable. The enemy army can cut off the marching column with a diagonal horizontal column, as long as it changes its formation slightly, and there will naturally be cavalry behind to harvest the troops that have left the main force. Berthier saw the enemy infantry lines at the mountain pass through the telescope and turned to Joseph and said, Your Highness, it seems that the Prussians are very confident and are ready to attack Major Lefebvre while fighting a decisive battle with us. There are 2 infantry lines in front, and an experienced commander can estimate that there are no more than 6,000 people at a glance. This is obviously not Blücher's main force. Then there is only one possibility. The Prussians had divided their forces. Joseph smiled and nodded. It means that their scouts did not grasp the exact number of our troops. Chapter 324 France's cheap troops. Yes, the Guards Corps also attaches great importance to counter-reconnaissance. Fully 1/3 of the hussars of the Guards Corps were dispersed for reconnaissance and counter-reconnaissance missions. Joseph knew that the current combat quality of the cavalry in the Guards Corps was not superior. Cavalry is a very difficult branch to train. After only 1.5 years of study, the Paris Police Academy students can hardly be called elite cavalry. Therefore, the combat deployment of the guards does not rely much on cavalry, but more on taking advantage of their youth, tirelessness, and passion, and using them as scouts. Such intensive cavalry counter-reconnaissance made it difficult for Blucher's hussars to get close enough to the guards corps, making it impossible to obtain an accurate number of soldiers. In fact, Blucher faced 13,000 guardsmen, far exceeding his expectations. This is because Joseph left the Milan army in Luxembourg City for stability. Of course, leaving the Milan army was also a factor so as not to scare Prussia and have nothing to play with in the future. After confirming the situation of the enemy troops with the hussars, Berthier showed a relaxed expression. It seems that the tough battle we planned will not happen. There are only more than 5,000 enemy troops and 30 cannons nearby. Joseph looked at the enemy infantry line in the telescope, recalling the military theory class he studied at the police academy, but said cautiously, "The one on the opposite side seems to be the Netherlands National Guard. We have to take it seriously." Berthier was a little surprised and said, "Your Highness, if I remember correctly, there are less than 1/5 of the regular soldiers in the southern Netherlands army, and the rest are just improvised citizens." Joseph shook his head. "Please believe me, these makeshift armies are no easier to deal with than the Prussian army." He is very familiar with the fanaticism of the southern Netherlands rebels in history, which even surpasses the French Grand Order. Relying on their enthusiasm for the Republic, these rebels caused a lot of trouble to the established European powers. "Yes, Your Highness." Berthier bowed slightly. "I will deal with it carefully." He turned around and had a quick chat with several other staff officers, then referred to the tactical plan he had made before, and issued a series of orders to the herald. Soon, the infantry line of the Guards Corps appeared opposite the Dutch army. There were more than 7,000 people, and they definitely took the latter very seriously. The French army has already been discovered in the southern Netherlands. From this distance, the opposite army can be seen with the naked eye. The commander, General Peter Rodriguez van Witt, rode past the infantry line and shouted to encourage morale. "Citizens, this will be the last battle before the founding of the great Republic of Southern Netherlands." Of course, it was also a very tough battle. As long as you block the brutal French here, General Blucher can wipe out the Austrian army. At that time, no one can stop the founding of the Republic. The Free Netherlands will always remember you. Long live the Republic. The soldiers immediately shouted excitedly, "Long live the Republic. Get rid of the greedy King of Austria. Long live freedom and human rights." These young faces are full of enthusiasm and fearlessness. If someone had told them that, by sacrificing their lives they would establish the Republic of the Southern Netherlands, they would have died without hesitation. In their eyes, bullets and cannons are just thorns on the road to freedom and human rights. Even if they prick their hands and feet, the blood can make the Republic more vivid and beautiful. This is why they can withstand so many casualties on the battlefield, that even a quarter of them can't collapse their formation. Among the European powers, this number usually does not exceed 10%. Of course, the French Guards Corps should also be able to reach the level of the Dutch, but currently no army can inflict this proportion of casualties on them. Just as General Witt was staring closely at the approaching French infantry lines and the skirmishers that might appear at any time, loudly urging the soldiers to stay calm, he heard the staff officer on the side remind him anxiously, "General, cavalry. It's French cavalry." General Witt hurriedly used his telescope to look in the direction he was pointing, and saw a large group of horsemen running out from behind the French army's formation under the smoke and dust. He frowned and said, "A large group of cavalry is not suitable for attacking infantry lines in a narrow area." The staff officer on the side immediately responded, "So, they should be heading for the cannon on the hillside." Different from the scenes that often appear in TV dramas where the cavalry rushes into the infantry queue and kills all directions. In actual battles, the cavalry does not dare to launch a frontal attack on the infantry. The infantry's bayonets are densely packed together, which can effectively blocking the horses. The cavalry will take a lot of bullets as they approach and leave. In addition, cavalry is extremely expensive. Even if 1 or 2 infantrymen can be killed by charging forward, it is still a huge loss. Therefore, the commonly used tactics of the cavalry are always to use their maneuverability to pull and find the weak points of the infantry formation, or to take advantage of the slow formation change of the infantry to attack on the flanks. However, when dealing with artillery, the cavalry didn't have so much to worry about. They usually just charged forward and slashed indiscriminately, and that was it. The artillery of this era was heavy and slow, and its hit rate was very poor. The cavalry only needed to slightly adjust the angle of the charge, and the artillery had almost no way to fight back. So cavalry is the biggest enemy of artillery, no doubt about it. Artillery will also be protected by infantry, or directly stay behind their own army to shoot. At this time, Blücher deployed the cannons on the hillsides on both sides of the infantry line. Although the shooting effect will be very good, it lacks the cover of infantry and is easily targeted by cavalry. General Wood turned to the messenger and shouted, "Quick, order the cavalry to cover the cannon. Also ask Major Hild for help, and let his cavalry withdraw to assist in defense." "Yes, General." Soon, the few cavalry of the southern Netherlands army came out and rushed to the hillside on the west side. The French cavalry attacked from the west. If they could get there in advance, they could form a dominant position against the French cavalry. At the same time, Hild, the commander of the Prussian cavalry, also led 6 cavalry squadrons to cover the artillery on their right wing. When the 2 cavalry teams arrived in front of the artillery position, they finally breathed a sigh of relief. Now they were just waiting to see how the cannons would smash the French infantry lines. However, to their surprise, the French cavalry that raised a cloud of dust did not rush towards the Prussian artillery positions on either side, but came straight to the front of the line infantry. General Wood put down the telescope and turned to the staff officer with some amusement. "Is the French cavalry so cheap that they are actually using it to charge our infantry lines?" "No, no, General, no." The staff officer, who was still holding the telescope, suddenly shouted, "That's not cavalry, but cavalry artillery, General." Wood frowned and looked carefully again with the telescope. Sure enough, he saw that there were more than a dozen cannons behind the war horses, turning the muzzles to point at the Dutch infantry lines. "What are they going to do, General?" Wood was confused. "Is the French artillery so cheap? So close to the Dutch positions, at most they can fire a dozen cannons, and when their own cavalry rushes over, they can't even run away." Chapter 325 Confidence and Adventure. The Prussian cavalry as the reserve and the Hild cavalry battalion responsible for covering the right-wing artillery soon received orders and quickly began to assemble to annihilate the group of French cavalry artillery who dared to confront the 2 armies. 69. At the same time, the French cavalry artillery battalion had completed its shooting preparations. The horses were driven more than 100 meters away, and the cannons adjusted the shooting angle. The messenger of the artillery battalion ran quickly in front of the temporary artillery position, shouting loudly, "Solid bullets. Prepare for calibration." The gunners skillfully filled the gunpowder into the muzzle, pestled it, and then stuffed it with a 6-pound iron ball. The company commanders received the report of preparation one after another, and the command flag not far away fell immediately. The igniter immediately pulled the firing rope, and the hammer at the rear of the cannon hit the primer heavily, igniting the gunpowder in the barrel. Yes. The cannons equipped by the Guards cavalry have all been replaced with percussion caps. In fact, after the percussion cap gun matured, the percussion cap firing technology can be easily transplanted to the cannon. All that is needed is to repeatedly adjust the structural strength of the firing port and to trial produce a slightly larger special percussion cap. These things were basically completed by the Royal Ordnance Factory at the beginning of the year with a loud rumble. A large amount of black smoke rose from the muzzle, and 12 iron balls whizzed towards the southern Netherlands army nearly 200 steps away. Under the close-range bombardment, nearly 1/3 of the shells accurately passed through the infantry line. The huge impact force swept through the human body like hitting a balloon filled with water, causing the flesh and blood to burst, and the red and black sticky substances were fanned out to a distance of 7 or 8 meters. Even the broken bones thrown out have terrible lethality, and the person who was stabbed is not much different from being hit by a bullet. Basically, the 1-meter range on both sides of the flight trajectory of a shell is an absolute dead zone, and soldiers within 2 meters may be killed. The shells left 4 gaps in the infantry line, and after landing, they bounced and continued to roll out. Even at this time, if they were hit by the black iron ball, they would immediately pay the price of broken limbs. There was even a shell that rolled to the 2nd infantry line behind the Dutch army because the gunner raised the firing angle a little too high, crushing the calf of a drummer. The captains of the cavalry artillery companies of the Guards Corps observed the shooting effect just now through the telescope and quickly ordered the gunners to adjust the shooting angle. Nearly half a minute later, the commander of the cavalry artillery battalion ordered, "Grape shot, 4. Killing infantry, solid bullets are just tickling, and grape shot is the real nightmare. It's just that the range of grape shot is short, so it is difficult to use it when the artillery of both sides bombards each other. It will be suppressed by the solid bullets with a longer range on the opposite side." At this time, the cavalry artillery of the Guards Corps has almost hit the face of the Dutch infantry, enough to use grape shot. After the loader pounded the gunpowder, he took a cylindrical iron barrel from the ammunition cart, carefully filled it into the muzzle, and then pounded it again. As the firing order was issued, the 12 6-pound gun spewed out thick smoke again, and this time it was not solid iron balls that flew towards the Dutch infantry line, but spinning cylindrical barrels. Many movies and TV series shoot shotgun shells when shouting to fire grape shot, but in fact there is a big difference between the two. Although grape shot also relies on shotgun shells to kill, it is not simply a bunch of small projectiles stuffed into the cannon, but a large number of small iron balls are fixed together with ropes, iron sheets, etc., and usually wrapped in multiple layers. After being treated in this way, the shells can fly far away by relying on the overall inertia compared to simple shotgun shells. When approaching the enemy, the fragile shell wrapped around the projectile will be torn under the impact, and the projectile inside will then fly out. The Southern Netherlands infantry line suddenly uttered a terrifying scream from hell. Thanks to the previous calibration, nearly 100 walnut-sized projectiles swept around the crowd like a huge fly swatter, instantly smashing 40 or 50 soldiers into pieces. The Dutch officer hurriedly shouted, "It's grape shot. Pay attention to lying down. Don't run around. Keep the formation." The French infantry line opposite was not far away. If they were to disperse and avoid the cannons at this time, when the French rushed up, the Dutch army might not be able to complete the formation, so they could only grit their teeth and hold on. Don't worry, at such a close distance, our cavalry will soon deal with those cannons. Once we deal with the French cannons, victory will be ours. The Dutch soldiers turned their heads and saw that their cavalry had basically completed the formation. They immediately gained confidence and began to fill the gaps left by their dead teammates. Less than 20 seconds later, the cannons of the French cavalry artillery sounded again. It was still grape shot, flying with a strange whistling sound different from ordinary artillery shells, but it stopped abruptly halfway, the shell broken throughout the projectile inside. Another bloody mist rose up, but because the Dutch soldiers deliberately ducked under the command of the officers, only more than 30 people were hit, but such a large number of casualties was enough to cause panic in the infantry line. In this era of smoothbore guns plus muzzle-loading guns, even if the infantry lines of both sides fired at close range, at most dozens of casualties could be caused. Few people have seen such a bloody and tragic scene. Major Hild could see the tragic scene on the Dutch infantry line. When he looked up, he turned around and saw that his cavalry had been roughly organized. He immediately pointed his whip forward and shouted angrily, "Follow me to teach those French artillerymen who are looking for death a lesson." Immediately, more than 800 war horses trotted out. This was already a violation of the cavalry manual. Generally speaking, trotting will start when approaching about 300 steps, and charging is allowed within 100 steps at this time. Hild's cavalry battalion was at least 700 steps away from the French cavalry artillery, and doing so would seriously consume the horse's physical strength. But Hild couldn't care about it at this time. If he didn't deal with those cannons, the Dutch would be bombarded by grape shot and collapsed, and at such a close distance, the cannons had no time to escape. He only needed to rush over and easily reap the fruitful results of more than a dozen cannons. In comparison, the few infantry lost before were nothing point. However, almost as soon as his cavalry galloped out, the French artillerymen at the forefront of the battlefield began to gather their firing tools and frantically put the cannons on the horses. Seeing this, Hild sneered. These stupid Frenchmen dared to pull the cannons so far forward. Even the most skilled gunners would take at least 5 minutes to put the cannons on the horses and start to retreat. And it would take several minutes to retreat to the range of their own infantry. Such a long time is enough for him to kill all these gunners, nail all the gun ports, and then smoke a cigarette comfortably. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.